Book 1, Chapter 1 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirsty. Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. Book 1. From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 1. Mrs Gildea had settled early to her morning's work in what she called the veranda study of her cottage in Leichardt's Town. It was a primitive cottage of the old style, standing in a garden and built on the cliff, the Emu Point side, overlooking the broad Leichhardt River. The veranda, quite 12 feet wide, ran, Australian fashion, along the front of the cottage, except for the two closed-in ends forming, one a bathroom and the other a kind of store closet. Being raised a few feet above the ground, the veranda was enclosed by a wooden railing, and this and the supporting posts were twined with creepers that must have been planted at least 30 years. One of these, a stephanotis, showed masses of white bloom which Joan Gildea casually reflected would have fetched a pretty sum in Covent Garden, and joining in with a fine-growing asparagus fern, formed an arch over the entrance steps. The end of the veranda where Mrs Gildea had established herself with her typewriter and paraphernalia of literary work was screened by a thick-stemmed grapevine which made a dapple of shadow and sunshine upon the boarded floor. Some bunches of late grapes, it was the very beginning of March, hung upon the vine, and at the other end of the veranda grew a passion creeper, its great purple fruit looking like huge plums amidst its vivid green leaves. The roof of the veranda was low, with projecting eaves, below which a bunch of yellowing bananas hung to ripen. In fact, the veranda and garden beyond would have been paradise to a fruitarian. Against the wall of the storeroom stood a large tin dish piled with melons, pineapples and miscellaneous garden produce, while between the veranda posts could be seen a guava tree, an elderly fig and a loquat, all in full bearing. The garden seemed a tangle of all manner of vegetation, an oleander in bloom, a poinsettia, a yucca lifting its spike of waxen white blossoms, a narrow flower border in which the gardenias had become tall shrubs, and the scented verbena shrubs almost trees. As for the blend of perfume, it was dreamily intoxicating. 2 bamboos guarding the side entrance gate made a soft whispering that heightened the dream sense. The bottom of the garden looked an inchoate mess of greenery topped by the upper boughs of tall straggling gum trees, growing outside where the ground fell gradually to the river. From where Mrs Gildea sat, she had a view of almost the whole reach of the river where it circles Emu Point. For as is known to all who know Leichardt's Town, the river winds in 2 great loops, girdling 2 low points, so that, in striking a bee-line across the whole town, business and residential, one must cross the river 3 times. Mrs Gildea could see the plan of the main street in the middle point, and the roofs of shops and offices. The busy wharves of the Leichardt's Land Steam Navigation Company, familiarly the LLSN Co., lay opposite on her right, while leftward, across the water, she could trace, as far as the grapevine would allow, the boundary of the Botanical Gardens and get a sight of the white stone and grey slate end of the big parliamentary buildings. The heat haze over the town and the brilliant sun sparkles on the river suggested a cruel glare outside the shady veranda and overgrown old garden. A pleasant study, if a bit distracting from its plenitude of associations to Australian-born Joan Gildea, who, on her marriage, had been transplanted into English soil, as carefree as a rose cut from the parent stem, and who now, after nearly 20 years, had returned to the scene of her youth, a widow, a working journalist, and shorn of most of her early illusions. Her typewriter stood on a bamboo table before her. A pile of Australian Hansards for reference sat on a chair at convenient distance. A large table, with a green cloth at her elbow, had at one end a tray with the remains of her breakfast of tea, scones and fruit. The end nearest her was littered with sheaves of manuscript, newspaper cuttings, photographs and sepia sketches, obviously for purposes of illustration, gum bottle, stylographs and the rest, with also several notebooks held open by bananas, recently plucked from the ripening bunch, to serve as paperweights. She had meant to be very busy that morning. There was her weekly letter for the Imperialist to send off by tomorrow's mail, And moreover, she had to digest the reasons of the eminent journal for returning to her an article that had not met with the editor's approval, the great Gibbs, a potent newspaper factor in the British policy of the day. It had been an immense honour when Mr Gibbs had chosen Joan Gildea from amongst his staff for a roving commission to report upon the political, financial, economic and social aspects of Australia, and upon imperial interests generally, as represented in various sideshows on her route. But it happened that she was now suffering from a change at the last moment in that route, a substitution of the commonplace P&O for the more exciting Canadian Pacific, Mr Gibbs having suddenly decided that imperialism in Australia demanded his special correspondent's immediate attention. For this story dates back to the time when Mr Joseph Chamberlain was in office, when imperialism, free trade and yellow labour were the catchwords of a party, and before the great Australian Commonwealth had become an historical fact. The imperialist's special correspondent looked worried. She was wondering whether the English mail expected today would bring her troublesome editorial instructions. She examined some of the photographs and drawings with a dissatisfied air. A running inarticulate commentary might have been put into words like this: "No good. I can imagine the letterpress all right once I get the hang of things, but when it comes to illustrations I can't even make a gum tree look as if it was growing. And Gibbs hates having amateur snapshots to work up. Hopeless to try for a local artist. I wonder if Colin McKeith could give me an idea. Why to goodness didn't Biddy join me? If she only had the decency to let me know in time why she couldn't. Money, I suppose, or a man. Well, I'll write and tell her never to expect a literary leg up from me again." Mrs Gildea pulled the sheet she had been typing out of the machine, inserted another, altered the knot to single spacing and rattled off at top speed till the page was covered. Then she appended her signature and wrote this address: "To the Lady Bridget O'Hara, care of Eliza, Countess of Gaverick, Upper Brook Street, London, W." on an envelope into which she slipped the letter, a letter never to be sent. A snap of the gate between the bamboos added a metallic note to the tree's reedy whimperings, and the postman tramped along the short garden path and up the veranda steps. "Morning, Mrs Gildea. A heavy mail for you." He planked down the usual editorial packet, 2 or 3 rolls of proofs, a collection of newspapers, a bulky parcel of private correspondence sent on by the porter of Mrs Gildea's London flat, some local letters, and finally 2 square envelopes, with the remark as he turned away on his round: "My word, Mrs Gildea, those letters seem to have done a bit of globe-trotting on their own, don't they?" For the envelopes were covered with directions, some in Japanese and Chinese hieroglyphics, some in official red ink from various post offices, a few with the distinctive markings of British legations and government houses where the special correspondent should have stayed, but did not. Only her own name showing through the obliterations, and a final readdressing by the Bank of Leichardt's Land. Mrs Gildea recognised the impulsive, untidy but characteristic handwriting of Lady Bridget O'Hara. "From Biddy at last!" she exclaimed, tore the flap of No. 1 letter, paused and laid it aside. Business first. So she went carefully through the editorial communication. Mr Gibbs was not quite so tiresome as she had feared he would be. After him, the packet from her London flat was inspected and its contents laid aside for future perusal. Next she tackled the local letters. One was embossed with the Bank of Leichardt's Land stamp and contained a cablegram originally dispatched from Rome, which had been received at Vancouver and thence had pursued her, first along the route originally designed, afterwards with zigzagging retrogression and much delay along the one she had taken. That it had reached her at all said a good deal for Mrs Gildea's fame as a freely paragraphed newspaper correspondent. The telegram was phrased thus: "Sorry, impossible. No funds, other reasons. Writing. Biddy." Mrs Gildea's illuminative implied that her 2 inductions had been correct. No funds, and other reasons, meaning a man. She scented instantly another of Biddy's tempestuous love affairs. Had it been merely a question of lack of money with inclination goading, she felt pretty certain that Lady Bridget would have contrived to beg, borrow or steal on a hazardous promissory note, after the happy-go-lucky financial morals of that section of society to which by birth she belonged. Or, failing these means, that she would have threatened some mad enterprise and so have frightened her Aunt Eliza, Countess of Gaverick, into writing a cheque for 3 figures. Of course less would have been of no account. Mrs Gildea opened the 2 envelopes and sorted the pages in order of their dates. The first had the address of a house in South Belgravia, where lived Sir Luke Tallant of the Colonial Office, and Rosamond, his wife, distant connections of the Gavericks. Lady Bridget's letters were typewritten, most carelessly, with the mistakes corrected down the margin of the flimsy sheets in the manner of author's proof, the whole appearance of them suggesting literary copy. Likewise, the slapdash epistolary style of the MS, which had a certain vividness of its own. End of Book 1, Chapter 1. Book 1, From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 2 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. Dearest Joan, you'll have got my wire. Vancouver was right, I suppose. I sent it from Rome. Since then, I have been at Montreux with Chris and Molly, and since I came back to England with them, I've been in too chaotic a state of mind to write letters. Really, Chris and Molly's atmosphere of struggling to keep in the swim on next to nothing a year, and of eking out a precarious income by visits to second-rate country houses and cadging on their London friends, gets on my nerves to such an extent that Luke and Rosamond's established Colonial Office sort of respectability is quite refreshing by contrast. I should have loved the Australian trip. Your bush sounds perfectly captivating, and of course I could do the illustrations you want. Besides, I'm stony broke, and financially, the great god Gibbs appeals to me. I'd take my passage straight off. One would raise the money somehow, if it wasn't for... There, it's out. A man has come and upset the apple cart. Mrs Gildea gave a funny little laugh. The letter answered her thought. Oh, of course, I can hear you sneer. Just another of Biddy's emotional interests, bound to fizzle out before very long. But this is a good deal more than an emotional interest, and I don't think it will fizzle out so quickly. For one thing, this man is quite different from all the other men I've ever been interested in. The first moment I saw him, I had the queerest sort of arrested sensation. He's told me since that he felt exactly the same about me, kind of lived before. When I was a king in Babylon and you were a Christian slave idea. Though I'm quite certain that if I ever was a slave, it must have been a pagan and not a Christian one. Joan, the experience was thrilling, positively electrifying, glamour, personal magnetism. You couldn't possibly understand unless you knew him. Descriptions are so hopeless. I leave him to your imagination. By the way, Molly annoyed me horribly the other day. You know, dear, she had the audacity to remark, he's not of our class, and if you married him, you'd have to give up us. For could you suppose, she went on to say, that Chris and Mamma, to say nothing of Aunt Eliza, would tolerate an adventurer who tells tall stories about buried treasure and native rebellions, and expects one to be amused? Our class! Oh, how I detest the label! And that unspeakably dreadful idea of social sheep and goats, and the unfathomable abyss between Suburbia and Belgravia, though I frankly own that to me Suburbia represents the absolutely impossible. After all, one must go right into the wilderness to escape the conditions of that state of life to which you happen to have been born. Well, that speech of Molly's came out of a fascinating account my soldier of fortune gave us of how he stage managed a revolution in South America, and of an expedition he'd made in the Andes on the strength of a local tradition about the Inca's hidden gold. I call him my soldier of fortune, though he's not in any known army list, because it's what he called himself. Likewise a champion of the dispossessed. He has an intense sympathy with the indigenous populations, and thinks the British system of conquering and corrupting native races simply a disgrace to civilization, with all of which sentiments I entirely agree. Luke has taken to him immensely, chiefly I fancy because he was once private secretary to some administering Rajah in an eastern archipelago or Indian island, and as Luke is hankering after a colonial governorship, he wants to scrape up all the information he can about such posts. I answered Molly that one may have a violent attraction to a man without in the least wanting to marry him, and that relieved her mind a little. As for him, the attraction on his part seems equally violent. We do the most shockingly unconventional things together. He tells me that I can carry him off his feet, that I've revolutionised his ideas about the nice English girl. Useless to protest that I'm not an English girl, but a hybrid Celt. He says that I've wiped off his slate the scheme of life he'd been planning for his latter years. A comfortable existence in England. His doctor advises him to settle down in a temperate climate. An appointment on some city board. Rubber shares and that kind of thing. You know it all. A red brick house in South Kensington, and perhaps a little place in the country. He did not fill in the picture, but I did for him, with a charmingly domesticated wife, well connected, the typical nice English girl, heiress of a comfortable fortune to supplement his own, which he candidly admitted needs supplementing. Of course, he's not a mere vulgar fortune hunter. He must be genuinely in love with the nice English girl, and that's where I upset his apple cart. In fact, we are both at an impasse. I'm not eligible for his post, and I shouldn't want it if I were. To my mind, marriage is only conceivable with a barbarian or a millionaire. From the sordid atmosphere of English conjugality, upon an income of anything less than an assured £5,000 a year, good Lord, deliver me. And you know my reasons for adding another clause to my litany. Good Lord, deliver me also from further experience of the exciting vicissitudes of a stock-jobbing career. Then again, apart from personal prejudices, I am appalled, quite simply, at the cold-blooded marriage traffic that I see going on in London. Any crime committed in the name of love is forgivable, but to sell a girl, soul and body, to the highest bidder, is to my mind the unpardonable sin against the Holy Ghost. Frankly, I'm petrified with amazement at the way in which mothers hurl their daughters at the head of any man who will make a good settlement. There's Molly's sister. She chases the game till she has corralled it, and once inside her walls the unfortunate prey hasn't swallowed his first cup of tea before she has wedded him in imagination to one of her girls. How do you like Mr. Chose? Like him? What is there to like? He's the same as all the rest of the men, and they're as like as a box of ninepins. But what do you think of him? But there's really nothing to think. But don't you think he'd do for Hester, etc., etc. She has just married the one before Hester to what she calls the perfect type of an English country gentleman, meaning that he owns an historical castle in Scotland, a coal mine in Wales, and a mansion in Park Lane. Heavens, I'd rather follow the fortunes of a nihilist and be sent to Siberia, or drive wild cattle and fight wild blacks with one of your bush cowboys, than I'd marry the perfect type of an English country gentleman. Give me something real, anything but the semi-detached indifference of most of the couples one knows. No, my man must be strong enough to carry me off my feet and to break down all the conventions of our class. Then I'd cheerfully tramp through the forest beside him, if it came to that, or cook his dinner in front of our wigwam. Now if my soldier of fortune were to ask me to climb the Andes with him in search of that buried treasure. But he won't. And I confess it, Joan, I'm in mortal terror of his insisting upon my entering the sphere of stock-jobbing respectability instead, and of my being weak enough to consent. But we haven't got anywhere near that yet. So far, I'm just living, trying to make up my mind about what it is that I want most. Do you know that since my violent attraction to him, or whatever you like to call it, all sorts of odd bits of revelations have come to me as to the things that really matter. For one thing, I'm pretty certain that the ultimate end of being is beauty, and that love means beauty and beauty means love. The immediate result of this discovery is that I'm buying clothes with a reckless disregard of the state of my banking account. I begin to understand and to sympathise with that pathetic striving after beauty which one sees in the tawdry finery and exaggerated hairdressing of a kitchen maid. Rosamund Tallant has one who is wonderful to behold as she mounts the area steps on her Sundays out. Formerly I should have been horrified at that kitchen maid. Now I have quite a fellow feeling with her piteous attempts to make herself attractive to her young man, the grocer's boy or the under footman, I suppose. Am I not at this very moment sitting with complexion cream daubed on my face, in order that I may appear more attractive to my young man? I know now how Molly's maid, who is keeping company with Luke's butler, feels when we all dine early for a theatre, and Josephine gets an evening out at the Earl's Court exhibition with her gentleman. Sounds beastly vulgar, doesn't it? But that's just what I'm making myself pretty for. Dinner there this evening at the French restaurant with my gentleman. It's quite proper. We are a party of 4. The other 2, I may add, are not in Rosamund's or Molly's set. I've been interrupted. He has telephoned. The other pair have disappointed us. Will I defy conventions and dine with him alone? Of course I will. End of Book 1, Chapter 2. Book 1, From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea, Chapter 3 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. The particular sheet ended at this point. Mrs Gildea laid it down upon the earlier ones and took another from the little pile which she had spread in sequence for perusal. She smiled to herself in mournful amusement, for she scarcely questioned the probability that her friend would in due course become disillusioned of a very ordinary individual. He certainly sounded a little like an adventurer who for some occult reason had been idealised by this great-souled, wayward and utterly foolish creature. How many shattered idols had not Lady Bridget picked up from beneath their overturned pedestals and consigned to memory's dustbin? On how many pyres had not that oft-widowed soul committed sati to be resurrected at the next freak of destiny? And yet with it all there was something strangely elusive, curiously virginal about Lady Bridget. She had been in love so often, nevertheless she had never loved. Joan Gildea perfectly realised the distinction. Biddy had been as much and more in love with ideas as with persons. Art, literature, higher thought, nature, philanthropy, mysticism. She spelled everything with a capital letter. Platonic passion, the last most dangerous and most recurrent. As soon as one emotional interest burned out, another rose from the ashes, and while they lasted, she never counted the cost of these emotional interests. But then, she was an O'Hara, and all the O'Haras that had been were recklessly extravagant, squandering alike their feelings and their money. There wasn't a member of the house of Gaverick decently well-to-do, excepting indeed Eliza, Countess of Gaverick. She had been a Glasgow heiress and only belonged to the aristocracy by right of marriage with Bridget's uncle, the late Lord Gaverick, who on the death of his brother, about the time Bridget was grown up, had succeeded to the earldom, but not to the estate. Gaverick Castle in the province of Connaught, which, with the unproductive lands appertaining to it, had been in the possession of O'Haras from time immemorial, was sold by Bridget's father to pay his debts. His brother, the heiress's husband, who, unlike the traditional spendthrift O'Haras, had accumulated a small fortune in business, was able by some lucky chance to buy back the castle, partly with his wife's money, soon after his accession to the barren honours of the family. His widow inherited the place as well as the rest of her husband's property, and could do as she pleased with the whole. Thus, the present holder of that ancient Irish title, young, charming and poor, stemming from a collateral branch, lived mainly upon his friends and upon the hope that Eliza, Countess of Gaverick, might, at her death, leave him the ancestral home and the wherewithal to maintain it. As for Bridget's father, the last but one Earl of Gaverick, his career may be summed up as a series of dramatic episodes, matrimonial, social and financial. His first wife had divorced him. His second wife, the mother of Lady Bridget, had deserted him for an operatic tenor and died shortly afterwards. She herself had been an Italian singer. Lord Gaverick did not marry again, and Mrs Gildea had gathered that the less said about his social adventures, the better. Financially, he had subsisted precariously as a company promoter. There had come a final smash, and one morning the Earl of Gaverick had been found dead in his bed, an empty medicine bottle by his side. As he had been in the habit of taking chloral, the coroner's jury agreed upon the theory of an overdose. Yes, Mrs Gildea could quite understand that apart from general views on the marriage question, Lady Bridget O'Hara might well shrink from further connection with city finance. End of Book 1, Chapter 3. Book 1, From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 4 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. A naughty little gust, herald of the subtropical afternoon breeze that comes up the Leichhardt River from the sea, blew about the typed sheets on the table, and, among them, those of Lady Bridget's letter, as Mrs Gildea laid them down. While she collected the various pages of manuscript that had been displaced, and was bundling them together, with a banana on each sheaf to keep it safe, there came a second snap of the gate, and a man's voice hailed her. It was the voice of a man who sang baritone, and his accent was an odd combination of the bush drawl grafted onto the mellifluous Gaelic from which race he had originated. "Any admittance, Mrs Gildea, except on business, during working hours?" "Yes, it is working hours, Colin, but you happen to be business because you're just the person I'm wanting to speak to, so come along." "Good for me, Joan." And the man came along, clearing the rest of the garden path and the veranda steps in 3 strides. He gripped Mrs Gildea's hand. "You're nice and cool up here, and you get every bit of wind that's going along the river," he said. "It's a good thing you kept this humpy, Joan. A little nest for the bird to fly home to, eh?" "Yes, I'm glad, though it seemed a silly piece of sentiment. And, as you say, I always felt the old bird might want to fly home for a bit some day." "Well, you look cool enough, Colin. This is a temperate zone for me after the Leura. But it's a hot March because we haven't had a proper rainy season, and I'll just stand here and catch the breeze for a minute or two before I sit down." He balanced himself on the veranda railing, took off his broad-brimmed Panama hat and mopped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. Mrs Gildea surveyed him with interested admiration. A big man, large-limbed, bony, a typical Scotcher in that, with thin flanks, a well-set-up back and massive shoulders. His face was browny red all over except where the skin ran white under the hair, and there was a ruddier ring around the upper part of the throat. His nose was thin between the eyes, broadening lower, high-bridged and with high-cut nostrils, showing the sensitive red when he was enraged, as not infrequently happened. He had large honest blue eyes, intensely blue, of the fiery description with a trick of dropping the lids when he was in doubt or consideration. They were expressive eyes, as a rule keen and hard, but they could soften unexpectedly under the influence of emotion. At other times, according to the quality of the emotion, they glowed literally like blue flames. He was considered queer-tempered, rather sulky, and his face often took on a very unyielding expression. He had thick reddish-yellow eyebrows at the base of a slightly receding forehead, wanting in benevolence, phrenologists would have said, and with the bump of self-esteem considerably developed. His hair was yellow, pure and simple, the colour of spun silk, only coarser, and it would have curled at the ends had he not worn it close cropped. His moustache and beard were rather deeper yellow, the beard short, well-shaped. The cut of Colin McKeith's beard was almost his only vanity. There was one other, the millionaire strut in town, and he had the masculine habit of stroking and clasping his beard with his large open-fingered hand, spatulate tips to his digits, the practical hand, fairly well kept, though brown and hairy. There were lines in his face, and a way of setting his features, that a man gets when he has to front straight some cruel facts of human existence, to calculate at a glance the chances of death from a black spear, a lost trail, an empty water bag, the horns of a charging bullock, or even worse things than these. And such experiences had put a stamp on him, and distinguished him from the ordinary ruck of men, these and his undeniable manliness and good looks. He smiled as he glanced amusedly from the littered wind-blown papers on the table to his hostess's rather troubled face. "Well, you seem to have a pretty fair show here of what you call copy," he said. Mrs Gildea met his look with one of frank pleasure. "That's what I want you for." "What's the job?" he asked. "You ought to know that literary copy is not much in my line. Now, if it had been yarding the fowls or cleaning up the garden, I'd feel more at home as a lady's help." "Colin, you take me back to Bungroopim, when it happened to be a slack day for you on the run, and when the married couple had levanted and I got an incompetent black gin in the kitchen, or when the store wanted tidying and you and I had a good old spree amongst the rubbish." He laughed at a time-honoured joke. "Stick sugar mats and wiggly flower bins, and a breeding paddock of tarantulas and centipedes and white lizards to clear out. I was a bush hobbledehoy in those days, Joan. It's close on 20 years ago." Joan Gildea gave a little shudder. "Don't remind me how old I am. There's the difference between a man and a woman. My life's behind me, yours in front of you." "I don't know about that, Joan. I've had my spell of roughing it, droving, mining, pioneering, humpy bluing along the track, stony broke, sold up by the bank and only just beginning now to find out what Australia's worth." "That's what I said. You are just beginning. Roughing it has made a splendid man of you, Colin, and who would ever believe that you are 4 years older than I am? Colin, you ought to get married." "The Upper Leura is no place for the sort of wife I want," he returned shortly. "I don't see that. It isn't as if you were going to stop there always. When you're rich enough you can put on a manager. You've got an enormous piece of pretty good country, haven't you? 1,000 square miles, and a lot more to be got for the taking. Mostly fair cattle pasture, now that we're going in for artesian bores. But it means capital, sinking wells 3,000 feet and more. It'll be 3 or 4 years at least before I can see a trip to Europe, doing the thing in the way I mean to do it. Must you go to Europe for a wife? Aren't Australian girls good enough? I've always meant to try for the best. You taught me that, Joan. I shall follow your example. You are an Australian girl. Mrs Gildea's face saddened. Well, was all she said. You see, he went on, and the eyes took their narrow, concentrated look, and suddenly blazed out as he straightened himself against the veranda post. I know something of what marriage in the back block means, and I've studied women. Don't laugh, I mean theoretically, from books. I've read history. Always managed a couple of volumes or so in my swag, nights and nights, by the light of a fat lamp and a campfire. I've studied the women of great times, ancient and modern. They're always the same. And I've remarked the type of woman that's got grit, capacity for fine things. You understand all that as well as I do, Joan. Look at the women of the French Revolution, for one instance. The aristocrats, you know. Well, I've realised that it takes blood and breeding and tradition behind to carry a woman to the block with a sure step and a proud smile. Suddenly he became aware of Joan's gaze, half surprised, wholly interested. He reddened and pulled himself up gruffly. Sentimental rot, do you call it? No, Colin, I believe in all that, and so do you. Blood and breeding and tradition, all the grand stuff that's been grown in them on the noblesse oblige principle, self-respect, courage, dignity. The stuff that gives staying power as well as the fire for making good spunk. Not that I'd put a pure-blood racer to haul up logs for an ironbark fence, any more than I'd set out to plant an English lady of that sort to rough it on the Leura. Well, why not? Do you want your wife to be like a canary in a cage? You know I don't hold with gilded cages and spoiling a woman who is there to be your mate. But all the same, I shan't look out for my wife until I can afford to give her as good a show as she'd be likely to have if she stopped at home. You see, a real woman must be a sportsman in her way of taking life as much as a man, and I maintain as a general proposition that it's the English lady, even one of your sneered-at Lady Clara Vere de Vere lot, who makes the best front against battle, murder and sudden death, if it has to come to that. Just because, he went on, though she might have been brought up in a castle and never have done a hand's turn that could be done for her, she's still got in her veins the blood of fighting ancestors, men who were ready to lay down their lives for God and King and country and their women's honour, and of women too who maybe held the stronghold that had been their husband's reward and kept the flag flying when to fail or flinch meant death or worse. Why, look at your Lady Nithisdales and your Lady Russells and your Maria Theresas. And your Joan of Arcs, who was a peasant girl, and your Charlotte Corday. Oh, you beat me there, and I wasn't intending to fire off a speech anyway. And anyway, Joan, it's awful cheek to think I could ever get the sort of wife I want, but if I can't, I won't have one at all. I'll have my money's worth. Romance, ideals, something more lifting than beef and mutton and cutting a bigger dash than your neighbour, see? He broke off with a laugh, and the wonderfully vivid light that came into his blue eyes made him look like an ardent youth. And you a Democrat, jeered Mrs Gildea. You a champion of the people's rights. You an imperialist in the broadest sense of the term. Oh, I really must put you into one of my articles as a certain type of modern Australian. In fact, Colin, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. All right, fire away. We'll drop the marriage question. To be resumed later. A quizzical look passed over Mrs Gildea's mouth, and then, oh, what a pity, she muttered to herself. What's a pity? Never mind. The English mail's in, as you may see. I'll show you what Mr Gibbs says. He didn't like my last letter. He says he wants bones and sinews, not an artist's lay figure dressed in stage bushman's clothes. There, Mr McKeith, among your other cogitations on the subject of women, you may try to realise that the mission of a lady special correspondent is not all, she looked round for a metaphor, muscat, grapes and pineapple, or cooked up information from heads of departments, or got up shows of agricultural, mining and other industries, or trips to the Bay to see the model island prison in which our weary criminals rehabilitate their enfeebled systems by cool sea breezes and generous diet, or ministerial picnics to experimental cotton and sugar plantations the size of your garden, to prove that all tropical products can be raised to perfection without mentioning the difficulty in a white Australia of finding the labour to do it. Oh, don't rub it in, Colin. I'm only a special reporter, and even special reporters can't know everything. Now, do just sit down and let me ask you questions. And first of all, do you want a whiskey peg or a cup of tea, or what? I've had my late breakfast. I'll have a smoke, please. Been swearing off store baccy now I'm down from the bush. I'm trying hard to smoke cigarettes like one of your English toffs. He pulled out a copper cigarette case with some hieroglyphical letters and numbers stamped on it, which he regarded with a humorous smile. Only cost $1, but now I've my brand across it looks fine. You know that by the Brands Act you've got to have a number and 2 letters on every head of stock. My brand's the mark of the beast, 666, CK. See? He fixed his cigarette into a new amber mouthpiece, made a wry face and began to smoke. I don't think much of your quality cigarettes, said Mrs Gildea. On the whole, I prefer your tobacco. All right, give me my pipe any day. And he pitched away the cigarette and produced an ancient pipe, which he filled with tobacco from an Indian rubber pouch and lighted. Now fire away. Not for a little bit yet. You must read my rejected article and my official instructions, and then you'll have some grasp of the subjects I want information upon. Here they are. Mr Gibbs first. She handed him her editor's letters and pushed a small pile of manuscript towards his elbow. There, it will take you about 1/4 hour to digest all that, and meanwhile, if you don't mind the noise, I shall go on typing something I've got to send off by tomorrow's mail. She settled herself at the typewriter, her back partially turned to him. The subject matter of what she was doing took all her attention. She worked hard for about 10 minutes, hearing subconsciously the rustle of papers under his hand, and 1 or 2 faint ejaculations, and a queer little laugh he gave once or twice as he read. Presently he said, I say, there's a mistake here. I've gone through your editor's letters. He's sound. I think I can help you to get at what he wants. But these other sheets have got mixed up with something else. I thought at first it was a story you'd given me, and I went on reading and got interested, and now I see it must have been written by some young woman friend of yours, if it's meant for a letter. Mrs Gildea turned with a dismayed exclamation. Good gracious, you don't mean to say that I've given you her letter? Is it really a letter? Do women type letters? It reads to me much more like what the heroine of a novel would be supposed to say than an ordinary everyday girl. If that's a flesh and blood woman, I'd like to know her. Mrs Gildea took from him the 3 typed pages he had in his hand. They were certainly part of Lady Bridget's letter, almost the whole of it, for only the end and the beginning ones were missing. In her hurried rearrangement of the wind-scattered sheets, she had put these into the wrong bundle. She ran her eye anxiously over the badly typed slips, which, with their marginal corrections and smart elusive jargon of a world entirely removed from Colin McKeith's experience, might easily have misled him into the belief that he was reading literary copy. Of course he knew that Joan Gildea wrote novels as well as journalistic stuff. He read her thoughts. You needn't worry. There isn't the least clue to her identity. I suppose that's what you're afraid of. Not a surname anywhere. I couldn't have imagined a woman would write like that, give herself away, as she does. But it's fine all the same. There'd be nothing small about that woman, Joan. Do you know how it ended? I don't know yet, but I can guess. Eh? He blew out rings of smoke with less than his usual deliberation. Do you think she'll marry the chap? No, she never does. She's a flirt then. Bid. Mrs Gildea swallowed the rest. She would scorn such a commonplace suggestion. Do you remember that novel of Hardy's, The Well-Beloved? She's like the man there, who was always in love with the same ideal, under different forms, until he found that he'd made a mistake, and then the game began all over again. McKeith ruminated. She's like that, is she? The fellow is what you'd call a bounder, he exclaimed suddenly. So I imagine. But she's in love with him. She must be, or she wouldn't write like that. You don't know her. She can't do anything by halves while she's doing it. By Jove, that's what I like. There's a woman who'd never hang on the fence. And her ideas about love and all that, it's splendid. He brooded again a few moments while Mrs Gildea sorted her papers afresh. Then he exclaimed, It strikes me she's one of the sort I was talking about just now. Well, she was born in a castle. I guessed it. You won't tell me her name? How could I ask you, after you'd read that? No. All right. You can trust me not to find out. Besides, she would never do for you. He laughed quizzically. "Well, I'm a barbarian, and it's possible I may some day be a millionaire, but I'm not such a conceited cad as to imagine a woman like that would ever fall in love with me." His voice sank almost to a reverential tone. "The only thing I do know is that if I got the chance I'd show her I was strong enough to carry her off to my wigwam, and she could do what she pleased afterwards. I'd be her slave so long as she cared for me, and I'd never live with a woman who didn't." "My dear Colin, you're not likely to get the chance. Please forget you ever read that letter." "No, I can't do that. But as she's in London and we're over here, it's not much odds anyway. Well, have you found the right sheets? Give them to me if you have, and then we can come to business." End of Book 1, Chapter 4. Book 1, From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 5 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. Colin McKeith had been gone some time, and Mrs Gildea, primed with fresh ideas, had finished her article on the lines he suggested, before she again tackled Lady Bridget's love affair. The second letter there is no need to reproduce the page of daring sentiment that closed the first was dated from Castle Gaverick in South Connemara, and plunged straight into the tragic culmination. "It's all over, Joan. Was over soon after my last letter, but I've been too wretched ever since to write. If you had been in England, you might have read in one of last week's Morning Posts that a marriage has been arranged and will shortly take place between Mr Willoughby Maule, formerly confidential adviser to His Highness the Rajah of Castlepore, and Evelyn Mary, only daughter of the late John Baggerly, Esquire, and the late Mrs Baggerly of Baggerly Court, Birmingham. Rosamond tells me that Luke told her that Evelyn Mary has been throwing herself at Will's head ever since they met last year on a P&O steamer between Singapore and Colombo. She and her chaperon went on a tour around the world, it seems, just before Evelyn Mary came of age. I wonder they did not get engaged then, and can only conclude, as there was no me then to upset the apple cart, that he did not know how rich she was going to be. Anyway, I feel certain that it was Evelyn Mary who was at the back of his plan for settling down as a respectable stock jobber. Molly Gaverick, who is a cat, said she knew for certain Willoughby Maule came to England with the fixed intention of marrying for birth and position or for money, and that he fancied in me he'd found both. She says that he took his impressions of us from the paragraphs in the society papers and thought us much richer and bigger than we are, and that now he knows better, he thinks it safer to drop birth and make sure of money. The Baggerlys made theirs in nails. Last year Evelyn Mary came into a fortune of $250,000. I'm told that it's absolutely at her own disposal. She was an only child. $250,000 would be an immense temptation to a poor and ambitious man. And yet, Joan, I can't believe that Will has been actuated by wholly sordid motives. He may be an adventurer, but he is not a mean one. Rosamond Tallant thinks it much more likely that because I didn't introduce him to Aunt Eliza, and Chris and Molly never asked him to dinner, he got the idea that I considered him good enough to amuse myself with, but not good enough for serious consideration as a husband. And it's quite true that I always shirked that point when it was touched upon. If I must be perfectly honest with myself, I think I was afraid of his putting me at the cannon's mouth, and telling me I must decide then and there to take him or leave him. Should I ever have had the strength to give him up? He's so frightfully dear to me that I can't think of him now without a shudder at the thought of his belonging to another woman. I never really believed it would come to that. He once or twice hinted that there was a girl, the nice English girl that I chaffed him about. I had an idea that it was his way of putting pressure on me. The first time was the evening that I dined alone with him at the exhibition. Heavens, I grow hot this moment thinking that he may have supposed I was in the habit of dining alone with men in French restaurants at popular exhibitions. I don't know why I did for this man what I'd never done for any other. Partly, I fancy, because it never dawned upon me that he could misunderstand me. Rosamond says I idealised him too much, and that he's just the ordinary man and not the tiniest bit of the Bayard I imagined him. I daresay she's right, and that he may have laughed in his sleeve at my romantic rhapsodies. All the same, I can never convince myself that he is a mere fortune hunter. Perhaps the very fact that I didn't make the smallest effort to wrest him from Mademoiselle Croesus when he tried to make me jealous seemed proof to him that he was no more to me than a caprice. So when we made each other an atrocious scene, and I told him to go off to her, he simply took me at my word. The scene began with my telling him about my sort of engagement to Aubrey Blaine, whom, as you know, I was really nearer to marrying than I have ever been to marrying anybody. And yet, as I tried to explain to Will, I didn't want to marry Aubrey. Only the mischief with me is always that I can't hold back with one hand and give with the other. Will wasn't able to enter into my feelings about that affair in the very least, or to understand how, when it came to the point, I realised that I couldn't sink to domesticity on $700 a year. Fancy taking a house in Pimlico or West Kensington, or one of those horrible places with a man to whom you have a violent attraction, and consulting with your adored as to whether you could run to have 3 maids and a tweenie. The sordidness of it would be too disenchanting. When I said something like that to Will, he flared up and we hurled nasty speeches at each other, and finally he walked off, slamming the door. I used to hear that slam in my dreams sometimes, or it may have been Luke coming in late. The Talents' Hall makes a particularly kismetish bang. That was our real parting, though it wasn't the last. He wrote to me, a bitter sort of farewell, and I did a mad thing. I went to see him in his rooms, but when I got there, his manner, something he said which offended me, one can't explain the unexplainable, started the scene all over again. It was as if a mocking demon came up between us. That time it was I who left him. The next thing I heard was that he and Mademoiselle Croesus were engaged. I wrote to him. I know it wasn't the proper sort of letter. I daresay he saw through my pretended indifference. He sent me back my letters as I had asked him to do, wrote me in quite the right strain, said he was not worthy of me, that I'd shown him I was far above him, that he might not presume to think that I could be happy with a man of his inadequate means and position, that he could never forget me, and so on, but that it was best as it is. And now I've got to get what consolation I can out of my own inner conviction that it is best as it is, and that I ought to be thankful for being still Bridget O'Hara, mistress of my own fate, and free yet to sport about. Sport! Oh, the irony of it, in what you call the stormy sea of my emotions. I make over to you the copyright of my sufferings. The letter broke off abruptly. It was resumed on another sheet 6 weeks later at Gaverick Castle. Rosamond Tallant has just sent me a writing case I left at their house with these pages in it. I daren't read them over, but they'll give you an idea of my state of mind during those last dreadful weeks in London. My nerves are now in a little better condition. Since I came here, I've set myself resolutely not to think of Will. That is, not more than I can help. There are times when his ghost is extremely active. I'm putting out brain feelers, for I know that I should go to pieces altogether if I didn't throw myself into some new interest. So that I'm trying a system for the development of one's higher faculties that was taught me by a queer old German professor I met at Kur last summer, who was interested in the odd little second sight experiences I've had occasionally, which I told him about. He made me do exercises in deep breathing and meditation. You shut yourself up, darken your room, and concentrate upon a subject. Beauty, wisdom, friendship were some of the subjects he gave me. And you can't think how thrillingly absorbing it was. I worked frightfully hard at it for a bit, drinking only distilled water and living on vegetables. You can do that in Switzerland. You simply can't in civilised society. And then came Rome and the Willoughby Mall episode. Episode? Has it come to that? Ah, Joan, I have a horrible suspicion that however much I may try to persuade myself I'm concentrating upon some abstract theme, I've really all the time been thinking of him. Yesterday I took friendship for my study and concentration. You, dear thing, came up naturally, and your image actually kept Will away for a clear 5 seconds. I thought what a help it would be to be with you, and afterwards I made the suggestion of an Australian trip on literary business to Aunt Eliza, but it was no good. She is deeply engaged just now in driving batches of stuffy relatives in a stuffy brougham. Luckily there's no room for me in it, to still stuffier garden parties. And besides, I don't think that I can take any desperate step of that kind until the irrevocable has been written in Destiny's book. Will Maule is not married yet. Well, anyhow, the meditation on friendship was comparatively successful. Wisdom I found beyond me, and beauty awakened painful memories. Today I meant to concentrate on wealth. One of my professor's theories is that if you concentrate regularly on a thing, you are bound, in the long run, to get what you set your mind upon. And I do find my position of dependence upon Aunt Eliza too unspeakably galling. What a monstrous injustice it seems that I, who if I had been born a boy, must have been an Earl of Gaverick, should be at the mercy of an ill-tempered, miserly old woman, who may leave the home of my forefathers to a crossing sweeper if she pleases. I suppose it ought to go to Chris, but one doesn't feel called upon to arraign fate on behalf of a distant cousin, who by rights has no business to be Lord Gaverick at all. I'm concentrating on art, too. Every day I do some inspirational painting by the seashore. I've made some studies of wave fairies for the children's storybook we plan to do together. It's quite invigorating to sport about with them in imagination, in a grey-green stormy sea, out of reach of human banalities. I can feel the cold spray as I paint and the sense of power and rest in the elemental forces, an almost Wagnerian feeling of great cosmic realities. Again Mrs Gildea smiled to herself. How like Biddy O'Hara. She couldn't be so utterly heartbroken if she was able to practise deep breathing and concentration, wealth, friendship, art, a pretty comprehensive repertoire, and to prate on cosmic realities and the Wagnerian feeling. But presently the tragic note shrieked again. Bridget went on. I am in a fever of suspense and misery, wondering whether Will's marriage will come off, or if, at the last moment, it will be broken. He has been obsessing me these last days. He too, I am certain of it, dreads the irrevocable, and regrets the rupture between us. I dream of him continually, such restless, tantalising dreams, and yet my mood is so contradictory. If the marriage were broken off, and he stood before me free and offered himself, could I bring myself to face our future together, with all its depoeticizing influences, its almost certainty of friction? No. Something deep down inside me says, has always said, it would be a mistake. This is not the real thing. We are not suited to each other. The attraction might even turn to repulsion. Imagine the agony of that. Life goes on here, all dribble, waste and fret. I cannot concentrate. I cannot paint. The wave fairies won't play. Your bush gobbies appeal more to my present humour. I feel a sort of nostalgia for the wild, though my nostalgia is mental, and not from any former association. Do not be surprised if some day you get a telegram saying that I am coming. Another sheet. Will was married yesterday. I have just read the account of the ceremony. I can see it all. The usual semi-smart opulent wedding, palms lining the aisle, orange blossoms galore. The bride, beautiful in cream satin and old lace. Evelyn Mary is simply a lump. Pages in white velvet, the fussy overdressed Bagley crowd of friends. I hear there are no in-laws. And the bridegroom's face, dark, cynical. I know the sort of miserable smile and the queer glitter in his eyes. I, Willoughby, take thee, Evelyn Mary, for better and for worse, till death do us part. There! I am a blathering idiot to mind. I ought to be dancing with joy at my escape. Let us end the chapter. The incident is closed. I'm going for a long tramp by the sea, and shall post this on my way. Your Biddy. End of Book 1, Chapter 5. Book 1, From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 6 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. Mrs Gildea was too busy in the next 2 or 3 weeks to trouble herself unduly over Lady Bridget O'Hara's tragic love affair. She had to report on the small holders of property in Leichardt's Land, and made a trip for that purpose among the free selectors in her own old district. The 20 years after letter she wrote about this expedition for the Imperialist was one of her best, and for that she was greatly indebted to Colin McKeith's commentaries. Old associations with him had been vividly reawakened by this visit to the home of her youth. She remembered, as if it had been yesterday, how McKeith, a raw youth of 18 with a horrible tragedy at the back of his young life, had been picked up by her father and brought to Bungroopim to learn the work of a cattle station. Hitherto his experience, such as it was, had been with sheep in the then unsettled north. Joan was herself a girl in short frocks, 3 or 4 years younger than Colin McKeith, and with no apparent prospect of ever crossing the big fella water, as the Ubi blacks called it, or of joining the band of Bohemian scribblers in London. She remembered how quickly Colin had learned his work, remembered how the shy, self-contained lad, with always that grim memory of his boyhood shaping a vengeful purpose in his mind and making him old for his years, had developed the flair of the bush in his hardy Scotch constitution. She was compelled to own that he had developed, too, some of the worst as well as the best of those Scotch qualities inherited from his parents, expatriated though they had been, and from the staunch clansmen behind them. He had the Scotch loyalty, likewise the Scotch tenacity of character, which never forgot and very seldom forgave. The Scotch obstinacy of purpose and opinion, the Scotch acquisitiveness, a tendency too to nearness in matters of small expenditure, which combined oddly with a generosity amounting almost to recklessness in large enterprise. It was, on the whole, not a bad outfit for a pioneer who meant to get on in his world. The beginnings were small but indicative of the trend of his career. He contrived, even when he was earning no salary, but working only for his tucker, to get together a horse or two, a cow or two, a specially good cattle dog or two, which last he made the nucleus of a profitable breed. The cows and bullocks he left at Bungroopim when the time came for him to push out, reclaiming them after they had increased and multiplied in those pleasant pastures, like Jacob's herbs in the fields of Laban. Not that there was any 7 years' matrimonial question. There had been no Leah, or if Joan Gildea had ever played the part of Rachel in Colin McKeith's sentimental dreams, those boyish dreams had left no serious mark upon him. He had gone north to a newly formed station, and had there outbushed the bushman in his knowledge of the idiosyncrasies of cattle and sheep, and his amazing faculty for spotting country suitable for either. Here no doubt his descent from generations of herdsmen had stood him in good stead. He sold his knowledge to rich squatters in the settled districts, who employed him to take up new country for them, and to manage the hundreds of square miles and the thousands of stock from which they derived the best part of their wealth. But he only managed for other men until he had made enough money of his own to take up and stock new country for himself. In a few years he had acquired a moderate-sized herd and established himself with it on the almost unexplored reaches of the Upper Leura. Life on that river never lacked dangerous adventure. McKeith's father had owned a station on the Lower Leura. The bank took it in payment of their mortgage after the catastrophe occurred. That station had been the scene of one of the most horrible native outrages in the history of Australia. The tragedy had set its mark on Colin McKeith. Left a penniless boy after having worked his way to independent manhood, he had made it his purpose to pursue the wild black with relentless animosity. All along the Upper Leura to the fastnesses at the river's head, where his new station stood on the boundaries of civilisation, he had gone, mercilessly punishing native depredations. He had been put on trial by a humanitarian government for so-called manslaughter of natives, and had been acquitted under an administration immediately succeeding it. Afterwards, he had, at the peril of his life, made an exploring trip across the base of the northern peninsula of the colony, with the intention, as he phrased it, of shaking round a bit. He shook round, to some purpose, penetrated to the Big Bight, and got on the tracks of a famous lost explorer. Colin McKeith solved the mystery of that explorer's fate, and had his revenge on the government, which had impeached him by pocketing the reward which it had offered any adventurous pioneer following on the lost explorer's steps. Later, McKeith was given a mission to explore and develop a certain tract of fertile country between the heads of the Leura and the Big Bight, the particular premier instigating the mission being a far-sighted politician who realised that a Japanese invasion of the northern coast might eventually interfere very radically with the plan for a white Australia. Colin McKeith threw into his own scheme of life a trip to Japan by way of India and China. He volunteered too for the Boer War, and did a short term of service with the Australian contingent in South Africa. He dreamed more and more of becoming an empire maker, a sort of Australian Cecil Rhodes, but he was wise enough to realise that all empire making cannot be on the Rhodesian scale. He realised that his personal fortune must first be secured. Without money one can do nothing. Cecil Rhodes had had the natural wealth of Rhodesia at his back. McKeith had set himself the task of opening up the fine country out west, which he knew only needed a system of irrigation by artesian bores to defy drought, the squatter's curse. That object once accomplished, he gave himself with luck and good seasons 5 or 6 years, there would be nothing to stop his becoming a patriot and a millionaire. But Colin went slowly and cannily, and that was why the Leichardt's Land Government believed in him. He had the reputation of never spending a penny on his private or public ambitions where a halfpenny would serve his purpose, and he was known to be a man of deep counsels and sparing of speech. Thus, no one knew exactly what was his business down south at this time, only the general remark was that Colin McKeith had his head screwed on the right way, and that some day he would come out on top. But that there was deep down a spring of romance beneath that hard bushman's exterior, Joan Gildea, herself a romance writer, guessed easily, and her intuition told her that a little thin bore had been made in the direction of that vital spring of romance by his inadvertent reading of Lady Bridget O'Hara's letter. End of Book 1, Chapter 6. Book 1, From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea, Chapter 7 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land, by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. Joan saw that McKeith was extremely anxious to know more about the writer of that letter and the progress of that love affair, though he had given his word of honour that he would not try to find out her identity. But he put subtle questions to Joan about her friends in England and her acquaintance with the higher circles of society in London. Once he asked her straight out whether she had heard again from her typewriting correspondent, and if the soldier of fortune had proved himself a bounder, as they had suspected. "Yes," Joan answered unguardedly. "I'm thankful to say that he is married to his heiress." The eager light which suddenly shone in McKeith's eyes startled Mrs Gildea. "You don't mean to say that you're thinking of her like that?" she exclaimed. "It's no use, Colin." "Probably not," he answered composedly. "Tell me, how does she take it?" "Deadly seriously. She's practising deep breathing and concentration to try and drive the man from her thoughts." "What? Oh, you mean theosophy and that kind of thing. I went to hear Mrs Annie Besant lecture once, and I couldn't make head or tail of it." "No, you wouldn't, but it was a German professor who taught me. No, I will not tell you her name." "Anyway, I know that it begins with a B, and I know that she's got one relation called Molly and another called Chris, and a friend whose name is Rosamond. Likewise that Rosamond is the wife of Luke. By Jove!" He stopped short and looked at Mrs Gildea with sharp enlightenment. They were in the veranda of her cottage, and he was seated on the steps smoking, his long legs stretched out against one veranda post, his broad back against another. "Seen the paper this morning?" he asked. "No. If you pass the Chronicle office, I wish you'd lodge a complaint for me against the vagaries of their distribution department. Twice lately I haven't had the paper till the afternoon." He pulled it from his pocket and, leaning across, handed it to her. "Read the English telegrams," he said. Joan stopped cleaning her typewriter and examined the column of latest intelligence. "Good gracious! So they've appointed Sir Luke Tallant new Governor of Leichardt's Land." "Luke! A coincidence, you'll say. No good telling me that. She wrote that Luke was hankering after a colonial governorship." "Well, he's got it," replied Mrs Gildea non-committally. "And if you read the leading article, you'll see that the Chronicle is justly outraged at so important a post as that of Governor of Leichardt's Land being given to an unknown man, who has never served outside the Colonial Office in London, and who doesn't even belong to the noble army of peers." "That's all nonsense. Luke Tallant's a friend of Chamberlain's, a thorough imperialist and a very good man for the post." "You know him then?" "I know of him." "From her." "Her! Has it come to her? Colin, if anyone had told me that you would ever be fool enough to fall in love with a woman you've never seen, I should have laughed outright. You don't even know what she's like." "I can see her in my mind's eye, as I used to see the women I read about by my campfire. You'd never believe either what a queer, idealistic chap I can be when I'm mooning about the bush. Don't you know, Joan," and his voice got suddenly grave and deep-toned, "you ought to, for you were a bush girl, and you've had menkind out in the back blocks. Don't you know that when a man has got to go on day after day, week after week, year after year, fighting devils of loneliness and worse, with nothing to look at except miles and miles of stark, staring gums and black smelling gidgee. Note: Gidgee, colloquial pronunciation of Gidea, an Australian tree. And dead finished scrub, and never the glimpse of a woman, not counting black gins, to remind him he once had a mother and might have a wife. Well, can't you see that his only chance of not growing into a rotten hatter (Note: Hatter, a white man who prefers the society of blacks) is to start picturing in his imagination all the beautiful things he's ever seen or read about, the sort of lady wife he hopes to have some day, and in making such a companion of her that she seems to him as real as the stars, and far more real than the gum trees. So as he'll keep saying to her always in his thoughts, "I'll keep myself sound and wholesome for your sake. I'll never forget that I'm a gentleman, so as you won't shrink away from me in horror if I've ever the luck to come across you down here on this earth." He stopped, fitted another cigarette from the copper case into the holder, and before beginning upon it, said without looking at Mrs Gildea: "I wouldn't spout like that to anybody but you, Joan. My word, though I see by your writing that you've a fair notion of how this cursed, grim, glorious old bush can play the deuce with a chap, body and brain and soul, if he doesn't wear the right kind of talisman to safeguard himself." "Yes, I understand. And your talisman, Colin? What was your picture of the lady wife? Describe your ideal and I'll tell you if she is the least bit like it." McKeith smoked ruminatively for a few moments. His eyes narrowed. The lines in his forehead and round his mouth showed plainly. He was gazing out into space, far beyond the sun-flecked Leichhardt River and the Botanical Gardens, and the glaring city and the range of distant hills on the horizon. "Well," he said at last, slowly, "you can laugh at me if you like, but I'll tell you how I see her. She is tall, got a presence, so that if she's there, you know it, and everybody else would know it, no matter how many other women there might be in the place. Most big men take to their opposites. Now, though I'm a big man, I've never fancied a snippet of a girl. 5'7" of height is my measure of a woman, and a good 10 stone in the saddle. What are you laughing at, Joan? I'm out there, I suppose." Mrs Gildea controlled her muscles. No, not in the least. In fact, your description fits the ideal wife perfectly. Go on, Colin. 5'7" and a good 10 stone. How is the rest of her? Fair or dark? Her hair now, and her eyes?" "Her hair. Oh, it isn't fair. Not yellow or noticeable in colour, like those dyed beauties you see about. Her hair is dark, soft and cloudy looking, and she's got a small head set like a lily on its stem, and her hair is parted in the middle and coiled smoothly each side and into a sort of Greek knot. In short, she's the cross between the Venus of Milo and the Madonna." Mrs Gildea was smiling amusedly. "Perhaps. Something of that sort. Dignity and sweetness, you know, those are what I admire in a woman, but not too much of the goddess or of the angel either. I shouldn't want always to have to load up with a pedestal when we shifted camp, and the only shrine I'd keep going for her would be in my heart. It's a mate I'm wanting, as well as an ideal." "Now you're laughing again." "No, I'm not. I agree with you entirely, and so would she." "There, you needn't tell me. I shouldn't wonder if I'd got the second sight where she's concerned." Again Mrs Gildea smiled enigmatically. "I shouldn't wonder, Colin. But you haven't finished your personal description. What about the colour of her eyes?" "Now I don't believe I could say exactly the colour of her eyes any more than of her hair. They're the kind, to me, that have no colour, soft and melting and sort of mysterious, deep and clear and with a light far down in them, like starlight reflected in a still lagoon. I say, Joan, you remember the old 8 Mile waterhole on Dingo Flat, middle of the patch of flooded gum and she-oak, that the blacks used to say had no bottom to it? Her eyes seemed to me a bit like that waterhole, no bottom to her possibilities." "That's true enough," assented Mrs Gildea. "There's no bottom to her possibilities." "I could tell it from her letter. She seemed to write flippantly about things, but that was just because she hates insincerity and flummery, and the world she lives in doesn't satisfy her. Why, it was as if I read slick through to her soul. That woman would go through anything for a man she really loved." He had a way of lowering his voice when he spoke of love, as if he felt it a sacred subject, and this in him surprised Joan. She was discovering a new Colin McKeith. She answered softly, "Yes, I think she would, if she really loved him." What I haven't been able to make out is whether she does care for that chap. You see, that would make a difference.' 'A difference? How? What do you mean?' 'I mean that I don't believe I should feel about her as I do if I wasn't going to meet her. Look here, Joan, you've as good as told me, and if you hadn't I'd be pretty thick-headed not to have put two and two together, that the Luke of her letters is Sir Luke Tallant, our new Governor. Well, if she was staying with him in London, and his wife is a friend of hers, why shouldn't she come and stay with them out here?' The idea had already presented itself to Mrs Gildea, but she tried not to show that it had, or that there had ever been any question of the sort in Bridget's mind. Colin had not read the opening sheet of her letter. 'I suppose more unlikely things than that have happened,' Joan said neutrally. 'But really, Colin,' she went on with strenuous emphasis, 'I can't understand this phase of you. You, a hard-headed bushman, to be dreaming romantic dreams and falling all of a sudden over head and ears in love with a figment of your imagination, just because you happen to have read by mistake some sentimental outpourings of a woman you know nothing about, and who would never forgive me if she knew I'd let you see her letter.' 'She won't know. You have my word of honour that I'll never give you away over that letter. Not under any circumstances. So you can set your mind at rest on that score, Joan. And as to my falling in love with a figment of my own imagination,' he spat the words out savagely, 'we'll see how far your remark is justified when she does come out and I recognise her, as I am convinced I shall do directly I set eyes on her.' Mrs Gildea burst into rather hysterical laughter, which manifestly offended Colin McKeith. 'We'll drop the subject, please,' he said stiffly. 'And now, Mrs Gildea, I'm quite at your service for any information you desire about the Big Bight country and the probability of a Japanese invasion, so soon as our future Commonwealth comes to crucial loggerheads with the Eastern Powers on the question of a strictly white Australia.' After that, Colin pointedly abstained from allusion to the ideal wife and to Joan Gildea's typewriting correspondent, as he had called her. He was very busy himself at this time, in connection with a threatened labour strike that was agitating sheep and cattle owners of the Leura district. Likewise with a report he had been asked to furnish of a projected telegraph line for the opening of his Big Bight country. Colin McKeith appeared to be deep in the confidence of the Leichardt's Land Executive Council, and to have taken up his abode for the winter session in the seat of government, though he seemed to regard his recent election for a northern constituency as an unimportant episode in a career ultimately consecrated to the elucidation of far-reaching imperial problems. Joan Gildea found him excellent copy, and the great Gibbs cablegrammed in code approval of her lately tapped source of information. She almost forgot Bridget O'Hara in her absorption in colonial topics, but 3 weeks before the expected arrival of the new Governor of Leichardt's Land, a cablegram was shot at her from Colombo, which made her feel that there was no use in setting oneself against destiny. This was the wire: 'Expect me with Tallants. Biddy.' She said nothing to Colin McKeith about the message, partly because his movements were erratic and he was a good deal away from Leichardt's Town just then. Thus, Mrs Gildea did not know whether or not he had read the flowery description telegraphed by a Melbourne correspondent who interviewed Sir Luke Tallant and his party at that city and wired an ecstatic paragraph about the beautiful Lady Bridget O'Hara, who was accompanying her friend and distant relative, the Honourable Lady Tallant. Anyway, McKeith made no references to the newspaper correspondent's rhapsodies when he paid Mrs Gildea a short visit 2 or 3 days before the landing of the new Governor, but his very reticence and something in his expression made Joan suspect that he was puzzled and excited, and would have been glad had she volunteered any information about Lady Tallant's companion. Joan, however, kept perverse silence. In truth, she felt considerably nervous over the prospect. What was going to happen when Colin McKeith set eyes on Bridget? Joan Gildea was a simple woman, though circumstances had made her a shrewd one, and she had all the elementary feminine instincts. She believed in love and in strange affinities and in hidden threads of destiny, all of which ideas fitted beautifully onto Bridget O'Hara's personality, but not at all onto that of Colin McKeith. End of Book 1, Chapter 7. Book 1 from the point of view of Mrs Gildea, Chapter 8 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. The first dinner party given by Sir Luke and Lady Tallant at Government House included Mrs Gildea and Colin McKeith. These two met in the vestibule as they emerged respectively from the ladies' and gentlemen's cloakroom. Both held back to allow certain members of the ministry to enter the drawing-room before them, which gave opportunity for an interchange of greetings. "Well," both said at once, and the tones in which the monosyllable was uttered and the glances accompanying it held volumes of hidden meaning. "I haven't seen you since the Governor arrived," Joan went on. "Where have you been all these 3 weeks?" "At Alexandra City, close on the desert, where they bored for water and struck ready-made gas. The whole place now is lighted with it. If you like, I'll give you material for a first-rate article upon an uncommon phenomenon of nature." "Thank you, I shall be grateful. Colin," hesitatingly, "I did think you'd have come and looked after an old friend at the big show in the Botanical Gardens when the Governor made his state entry." "State entry? Good Lord! Sir Luke Tallant has got a bit too much red tape and too many airs about him to suit the Leichardt'stonians. You were there then? Started for Alexandra City that afternoon. But you saw Colin, did you see the Tallants and their party?" His face changed. It looked positively angry, and his jaw under the neatly trimmed, sandy beard protruded determinedly. But at that moment a footman came towards them, and Mrs Gildea was handed on to an imposing butler and ushered through a wide, palm-screened doorway into the large inner hall, which had a gallery round it and the big staircase at one end. Joan saw that the room, formerly stiffly furnished and used chiefly as a ballroom, had been transmogrified with comfortable lounge chairs and sofas, beautiful embroideries, screens, a spinet and many flowers and books into a delightful general sitting room. It seemed quite full, mostly of official Leichardt'stonians. Joan looked for the new Governor and his wife, or at least for Lady Biddy, but none of them had yet put in an appearance. A handsome, fair-moustachioed young aide-de-camp, looking very smart in his evening uniform with white lapels, was fluttering round, his dinner list in his hand, and introducing people who already knew each other. He looked distinctly worried, so did the private secretary, sallow-faced, of a clerkish type, and obviously without social qualifications, who was also wandering round and trying ineffectively to do the right thing. The aide-de-camp rushed forward to shake hands with Joan, exclaiming in a relieved undertone, "Oh, Mrs Gildea, do help me. I believe I've made an awful hash of it all. People out here," he murmured, "ain't used to viceregal etiquette as she is interpreted in Ceylon. That was my last post, you know. They seem to think His Excellency ought to have been standing at the door to receive them, instead of their waiting to receive him." Clearly the aide-de-camp had failed to please, though he looked spruced and his manners were beautiful. The Premier of Leichardt's Land, a red-faced gentleman of blunt speech, was grumbling audibly to the Attorney-General. Mrs Gildea caught snatches of discontent as she passed from one to another. "Damned impertinence, I call it. A salaried official, no better than any of us, giving himself royal airs. May do in India, won't go down in a free country like this." The aide finished pairing his couples. "Mrs Gildea, you're to go in with the warden of the University. Of course you know Dr Plumtree. Literature and learning is an obvious combination, but," in a confidential aside, "if you knew the job I've had to find out the right order of precedence. Mr McKeith, the Governor will be so glad to meet you. Will you take in Lady Bridget O'Hara? She's not down yet. You see," he explained again to Mrs Gildea, "we're strictly official tonight, and Debrett's out of it." "So am I," put in Colin McKeith. "I guess that Lady Bridget would be better pleased if she wasn't handed over to a rough bushman." "Now there you are quite out of it," laughed the aide-de-camp. "Lady Bridget asked specially to be sent in with you." And at Mrs Gildea's inquiring smile, he explained once more. "Sir Luke was speaking about Mr McKeith. Said his name had been mentioned at a meeting of the Executive yesterday." "Oh, you're a top hole, Mr McKeith, I assure you." The aide broke off suddenly. There was a rustle of silk on the grand staircase, the slam of a door above, the sound of a laugh and the patter of little high-heeled shoes on the parquet floor of the gallery. The aide darted to the foot of the staircase and all eyes turned upward. The new Governor and his wife came down in slow and stately fashion, arm in arm, Sir Luke looking very impressive with the ribbon and Order of St Michael and St George. He was a handsome man, clean shaven, but for a heavy dark moustache, and carried his dignities with perhaps a little too conscious an air. Representative of the Throne seemed written all over him, and no greater contrast could be imagined than the new Governor presented to his predecessor, an elderly, impoverished Marquis, who had the brain of a diplomatist and the manners of a British farmer, and who, with his homely wife, had been immensely popular in Leichardt's Land. Nor a greater contrast than the new Governor's wife to the fat, kindly old Marchioness. Lady Tallant was a London woman, of about 45. She had been excessively pretty, but had rather lost her looks after a bad illness, and her worst affliction was now a tendency to scragginess, cleverly concealed where the chest was no longer visible. Obviously artificial outside, at any rate, Lady Tallant was, as Mrs Gildea had reason to believe, a genuine sort underneath. She had a thin, high-nosed face, of the conventional English aristocratic type, a good deal rouged tonight, but with natural shadows under the eyes, and below the arch of the brows, which were toned to correspond with the evidently dyed hair. Her dress, a Paris creation of pale satin and glistening embroidery, was draped to hide her thinness, and her neck and throat were almost covered with strings of pearls and clusters of clear-set diamonds. Judging from the way in which the Leichardt'stonians stared at her as she came down the stairs, it seemed probable that none of them had ever before seen anyone quite like Lady Tallant. Joan Gildea's eyes passed quickly from Sir Luke and Lady Tallant to a third figure behind them, on the half-landing, but first she realised, in a flashing glance, that Colin McKeith's gaze had been all the while riveted upon that figure, not in astonishment, a proof to Joan that he had seen it before, but in a kind of unwilling fascination, most upsetting to Mrs Gildea's sense of responsibility in the matter. The visionary woman of the campfire! And she had let Colin McKeith believe that Bridget O'Hara was the embodiment of his ideal. Height 5'7" at the least, weight 10 stone or more, smooth, parted, Greek coiled hair, a cross between a goddess and a Madonna. That was Colin's ideal. Good heavens, what did he now behold? A very little woman, one of the snippets he despised. Not an ounce of the traditional dignity about her. Lady Bridget gave the impression of an old-fashioned, precocious child, dressed up in a picture frock of soft, shining white stuff, hanging on a straight, slender form, and gathered into a girdle at the waist, with a wisp of old lace flung carelessly over the slight shoulders. She stood for a moment or two on the half-landing. Then, as the aide-de-camp murmured in the Governor's ear at the foot of the stairs, she came close to the banisters and looked down amusedly at the party in the hall. Her face was a little poked forward, a small oval face, pale except for the redness of a rather thin-lipped mouth, the upper lip like a scarlet bow, and the brilliance of the eyes, deep set under finely drawn brows, and with thick lashes, golden brown, and curling up at the tips. Peculiar eyes. Mrs Gildea, who knew them well, never could decide their exact colour. The nose was a delicate aquiline, the chin pointed. An untidy mass of wavy chestnut hair stuck out in uneven puffs and insubordinate curls all round the small head. At this moment Mrs Gildea remembered a suggestive charm sent to Lady Bridget by her cousin, Chris Gaverick, one Christmas, of a miniature gold curry comb. It was a vivid, brief impression, for the girl moved on immediately, but Joan noticed that Colin McKeith had arrested Lady Bridget's wandering gaze. That was not surprising, for his great height and the distinctiveness of his appearance made him more likely than anyone else present to attract her attention. Then, as she caught sight of Joan, the interested, startled look changed to one of bright recognition. The red lips smiled, showing dimples at their sensitive corners. 'His Excellency and Lady Tallant,' said the aide-de-camp, and Bridget seemed hardly able to keep herself in the background, while Sir Luke and his wife advanced to greet the assembled guests. This Lady Tallant did with quite enchanting courtesy, making an apt apology for having kept them waiting, which almost mollified the irate Premier. Bridget came with a swift gliding movement to the side of her friend, squeezed her hand and held it, while she talked in a soft rapid monotone. 'How cool you look. I've never been so hot in my life. And the mosquitoes. Rosamond is in despair. She says she really can't afford to lose more flesh. Do you see how she has had to make herself up to hide the mosquito bites? Luckily I've got skin that insects don't find palatable.' They had of course met since the landing. Joan had paid her formal visit, had lunched at Government House, and was now on intimate terms with the new people. Also, Lady Bridget had found her way to the cottage on Emu Point. She looked round at the different groups and gave a cynical little shrug. "Why, it's like everything one had left behind. I might be at a party to the colonial delegates in London for all the difference there is. Where's your barbarism, Joan? I'm pining for a savage existence. That's an excessively good-looking man." Her eyebrows indicated Colin McKeith. "I do hope he is the man I asked for to take me into dinner. I told Vereker Wells that I wanted a new sensation. That man looks as if he might give it to me. No, don't tell me. There's excitement in uncertainty." She went on in eager monologue, giving no time for replies. "It seems we've put the official backs up. Vereker Wells was determined to follow Indian viceregal precedents. So ridiculous, as I told him. And as for Luke, he's got it on the brain that his mission is to uphold the dignity of the British throne. Like a nouveau riche, terribly afraid of doing the wrong thing, and showing every moment that he's new to the great Panjandrum part." "Ah, so!" An ejaculatory trick of Bridget's. "He is my fate." Captain Vereker Wells brought up Colin, who was holding himself stiffly, limping just a little as he did when he was nervous, and looking very big and strong and masterful, likewise extraordinarily well groomed and tailored. "Lady Bridget O'Hara, let me present Mr Colin McKeith." Lady Biddy looked up at Colin, and he looked down at her. "Do you think I can possibly reach your arm?" as he held his elbow crooked to about the level of her shoulder. "You know I asked to be sent in with you. It was rather bold of me, wasn't it? But if I had known how very tall you are." Mr McKeith lowered his arm, stooping over her, and Mrs Gildea heard him say in a voice that sounded different somehow from his ordinary deep drawl, "I wonder why I was chosen for this honour." And Lady Bridget's reply, "I'd been told that you're an explorer, that you're a kind of bush Cecil Rhodes. I don't know Mr Cecil Rhodes, but I have an adoration for him. I wanted to talk to a real bushman. I always felt that I should like Australian bushmen from Joan Gildea's description of them. And you—" The rest was lost as the groups converged and the long line of couples went forward. End of Book 1, Chapter 8. Book 1, From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 9 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. It was not an altogether successful party. The dinner had portentous suggestiveness. The Leichardt'stonians were at first rather difficult. Sir Luke a little too conscious of his responsibilities towards the British throne. Lady Tallant so brilliant as to be bewildering. But except as it concerns Lady Bridget and McKeith, the Tallants' first dinner party at Government House is not of special importance in this story. Mrs Gildea, very well occupied with Dr Plumtree, only caught diagonal glimpses of her two friends a little lower down on the opposite side of the table, and, in occasional lulls of conversation, the musical ring of Lady Bridget's rapid chatter. Colin did not seem to be talking much, but every time Mrs Gildea glanced at him, he appeared absorbed in contemplation of the small pointed face and the farouche, golden brown eyes turned up to him from under the top-heavy mass of chestnut hair. Lady Bridget, at any rate, had a great deal to say for herself, and Mrs Gildea wondered what was going to come of it all. Conversation became more general as champagne flowed and the courses proceeded. Sir Luke, discreetly on the prowl for information, attacked Antipodean questions, the blacks for instance. He had observed the small company of natives theatrically got up in the war paint of former times, which, grouped around the dais on which he had been received at the State Landing, had furnished an effective bit of local colour to the pageant. Up to what degree of latitude might these semi-civilised, and he feared demoralised beings, be taken as a survival of the indigenous population of Leichardt's Land? Did wild and dangerous blacks still exist up north and in the interior of the colony? "You'd better ask McKeith about that, Your Excellency," said the Premier. "He knows more about the blacks up north than any of us." The Governor inquired as to the amenability of the Australian native to missionary methods of civilisation, and one of the other ministers broke in with a laugh. "Bible in one hand and baccy in the other. No, sir, the Executor Hall and General Gordon principles aren't workable with our blacks. Kindness doesn't do. The early pioneers soon found that out." Lady Bridget had stopped suddenly in her talk with Colin and was listening, her eyes glowering at her companion. "Why didn't kindness do?" she asked sharply. "Yes, Mr McKeith, tell us why the early pioneers abandoned the gentle method," said the Governor. McKeith's face changed. It became dark and a dangerous fire blazed in his blue eyes. Because they found that the blacks repay kindness with ingratitude, treachery, foul murder. He pulled himself up as though afraid of losing command of himself if he pursued the subject. His voice thrilled with some deep-seated feeling. Mrs Gildea, who understood the personal application, broke in across the table with an apposite remark about her own early experiences of the blacks. Lady Bridget impatiently addressed McKeith. "Go on. What do the blacks do now to you people to make you treat them unkindly?" "What do they do now? To us squatters, you mean?" Colin had recovered himself. "Why, they begin by spearing our cattle, and then they take to spearing ourselves." "Did they ever spear you?" she asked. Colin smiled at her grimly. "Well, you wouldn't have noticed, of course, that I've got just a touch of a limp. It's only if I'm not in my best form that it shows. I owe that to a spear through my thigh one night that the blacks rushed my camp when I was asleep, and I'd given their gins rations that very morning." "And then?" Lady Bridget's voice was tense. "Oh then, after they'd murdered a white man or two, the rest of us whites, there wasn't more than a handful of us at that time up on the Leura, banded together and drove them off into the back country. We had a dangerous job with those blacks until King Mograbar was shot down." "King Mograbar? How cruelly unjust! It was his country you were stealing." She accentuated the last word with bitter scorn. "Well, if you come to that, I suppose Captain Cook was stealing when he hoisted the British flag in Botany Bay," said McKeith. "And if he hadn't, what about the glorious British record and the march of civilisation?" put in Vereker Wells. Bridget shot a scathing glance at the aide-de-camp. "I don't admire your glorious British record. I think it's nothing but a record of robbery, murder and cruelty, beginning with Ireland and ending with South Africa." "Oh, my dear, I warn you," said Lady Tallant, bending from her end of the table and addressing the Leichardt'stonians generally. "Lady Bridget is a little Englander, a pro-Boer, a champion of the poor oppressed native. If she had been alive then, she'd have wanted to hand India back to the Indians after the mutiny. And now, when she has made Cecil Rhodes Emperor of Rhodesia, she'll give over all the rest again to the Dutch." Bridget responded calmly to the indictment. "Yes, I would. If Cecil Rhodes were to decline the Emperorship of all South Africa, which I should make his job. But you'd better add on that I'm a Socialist too, Rosamond, because I've become one, as you know. I think the working man is in a shamefully unjust position, and that the capitalists are no better than slave drivers." "Oh, not out here, my word," exclaimed a Leichardt'stonian, who happened to be one of the old squattocracy. "The landowners and the capitalists are not slave drivers, they are slave driven. We've got to pay what the Trades Union organisers tell us, or else go without stockmen and shearers. Fact is, our labour war is only just beginning, and I can tell you, sir, that before a year is out, the so-called bloated capitalist and the sheep and cattle station owner will sing either pretty big or very small." "I don't think it will be very small on MY station," murmured McKeith. "But it's quite true about the labour war. They're organising, as they call it, already all along the Leura." The Governor asked to have the labour situation explained from the squatters' point of view, and for a few minutes McKeith forgot to look at Lady Bridget. He was on his own ground and knew what he was talking about. "It's this way," he began. "You see, though, I'm cattle, and I'm the furthest squatter out my way. But there are a few sheep stations down the river, and there isn't an unlimited supply of either cattle hands or shearers, so we've got to look sharp about hiring them. Now, last year, we, of course I'm classing myself with the sheep owners, for we all stand together, hired our shearers for 17 shillings and 6pence a day. Then, up come the union organisers, form a union of the men and say to them, you've got to pay 10 shillings down to the union and sign a contract that you won't shear under 20 shillings a day. The organiser pockets the 10 shillings and makes £3 a week and his expenses beside, so it pays him pretty well. Well, then the shearers go to the squatters. All right, they say, we'll shear your sheep, but it's going to be 20 shillings instead of 17 and 6. The squatters grumble, but they've got to have their sheep shorn, and they pay the 20 shillings. Next year I'm told the word is to go around that it's to be 22 and 6pence. Well, sir, we're to see what's to happen then." The Labour talk lacked a local picturesqueness, so Luke preferred the blacks, and started the question of danger to white men in the out districts. How far had officialdom penetrated into the back blocks? He understood that Mr McKeith had explored for the laying of a telegraph line to the Big Bight. Could Mr McKeith give him any information about all that? McKeith explained again. He had stopped a week, he said, at the last outpost of Leichardt's Land civilisation. The telegraph master there lived in a hut made of sheets of corrugated zinc, raised on piles 20 feet high and fortified against the Blacks. The entrance to it was masked, spear-proof, and had 2 men always on guard. There were 4 men at the post. McKeith told a gruesome story of an assault by the natives and of rifles at work through gun holes in the zinc tower. Lady Bridget listened in silence. Now and then she looked up at McKeith, and though her eyes gave forth ominous red-brown sparks, they had in them something of the same unwilling fascination Joan Gildea had noticed in the eyes of Colin McKeith. End of Book 1, Chapter 9. Book 1, From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 10 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. In the drawing room, before the men came in, Bridget talked to Joan Gildea. They hadn't yet had, as Biddy reminded her, a regular outpouring. The outpouring, it should be stated, was always mostly on Bridget's side. "When did you start Socialism?" Mrs Gildea asked. "That's something new, isn't it?" Biddy gave one of her slow smiles, in which lips, eyes, brows, what could be seen of them under the tousle of hair, all seemed to light up together. "Why, I've always been a Socialist, in theory, you know. I've always rebelled against the established order of things." "But latterly," said Joan, "I haven't heard anything about your doings, not since you wrote from Castle Gaverick after Mr Willoughby Maule's marriage." The light died out of Bridget's face. "Ah, I tell you. Do you know, Rosamond saw them, the Willoughby Maules, before we all left. She met them at Shoolbred's, buying furniture. Rosamond said SHE was dragging after him, looking a bundle, and cross and ill, and that he seemed intensely bored. Poor Will." There was a silence. Bridget's thoughts seemed far away. "But about the Socialism?" prompted Mrs Gildea. "Oh, well, Aunt Eliza made up her mind suddenly to consult her new doctor. Aunt Eliza's chief excitement is changing her doctors, and she grows quite youthful in the process. They say that love and religion are the chief emotional interests of unattached women. I should add on doctors when a woman is growing old. Don't you think, Joan, that in that case all 3 come invariably to the same thing?" "Love, religion and doctors? As emotional interests, do they come to the same thing for elderly women?" repeated Mrs Gildea, as if she were propounding a syllogism. "No, certainly not, when the elderly woman happens to be a hard-working journalist." "Oh, there you have the pull. I suggested the idea to Rosamond the other day, and she gave a true Rosamondian answer. They don't at all come to the same thing, she said, because usually you have to pay your doctor, and sometimes your lover pays you." Rather smart, wasn't it? "Yes, but I think you'd better warn Lady Tallant that the Leichardt'stonian ladies are a bit puritanical in their ideas of repartee." "Oh, Rosamond is clever enough to have found that out already for herself," and the 2 glanced at Lady Tallant, who seemed to be playing up quite satisfactorily to the female representatives of the ministerial circle. "I suppose you made friends with some Socialists when you were in London," went on Mrs Gildea. "My dear, I would have made friends with Beelzebub just then, if he would have helped me to escape from myself." Bridget sighed and paused. "But you are getting over it, Biddy, the disappointment about Mr Maule. You are growing not to care." "I don't want to grow not to care, though of course now I should prefer to care about someone or something that isn't Willoughby Maule. I feel inside me that my salvation lies in caring intensely. But you wouldn't understand, Joan. You weren't built that way." "No," assented Mrs Gildea doubtfully. "But," went on Biddy brightly, "I think sometimes that if one could get to the pitch of feeling nothing matters, it would be a way of reaching the letting go stage which one must arrive at before one can even begin to live in the eternal." There seemed something a little comic in the notion of Bridget O'Hara living in the eternal, and yet Mrs Gildea realised that there really was a certain stable quality underneath the flashing, ever-changing, temperamental sheath which might perhaps form a base for the verities to rest upon. "Beelzebub didn't teach you that," she said. "No, quite the contrary. It all came out of my concentration studies and the Higher Thought Centre, where I met some most original dears, Christian Scientists and Spiritualists, and then these Socialists, not a bit on the lines of the old Fabians and Bernard Shavians, and the rest who used to believe only in matter, specially landed property matter, and in parcelling that out among themselves. My friends are for parcelling out what they call the Divine Intelligence, which they say will bring them everything they need for the good of others and, incidentally, themselves. Of course none of them have a penny, but they do contrive to get what they want for other people. It was a soup kitchen this winter where they fed 11,000 starving poor. Only when they begin, they never have the smallest idea of how it's going to be done." Lady Bridget was so absorbed in her subject matter that she did not notice the entrance of the men, but Mrs Gildea saw that Colin McKeith was making straight towards them. He halted behind Bridget's chair. Biddy went on in reply to a question from her friend. "You see, they argue this way. We don't know, they say, the how of the simplest things in life. We don't know the how of our actual existence, how we move or think, not even the how of the most ordinary fact in science. We only know that there must be an intelligence who does know, and who has forces at command and the power to set them in motion." "And how do we know that?" asked Colin McKeith. Bridget turned with a start and looked at him solemnly for a second or two. "You paralyse me. You are too big. I can't speak to you when you are standing up. Please sit down." He went to fetch a chair. At the moment, Lady Tallant came up. "Biddy, will you sing? Do for heaven's sake make a sensation. Help me out. You know how." Lady Bridget had a funny inscrutable little smile and a gleam in her eyes which crinkled up when she was going to say or do something rather naughty. "I'll do my best, Rosamond, but you don't think it would be a dangerous experiment, do you?" Lady Tallant laughed and told Captain Vereker Wells to take her to the piano. "You know that Biddy does a lot of mischief when she sings," said the Governor's wife, sitting down in Lady Bridget's vacant place beside Mrs Gildea. Colin McKeith, still on the outskirts with his chair, stood leaning upon it, watching the performer. The piano was in such a position that Lady Bridget faced him. A vain man might have fancied that she was singing at him, and that the byplay of her song, the sudden eye brightenings, the little twists of her mouth, the head gestures, were for his particular benefit. She was singing one of the Neapolitan folk songs, which one hears along the shores of the Mediterranean, beyond Marseilles, a love song. Most people know that particular love song. Lady Bridget gave it with all the tricks and all the verve and whimsical audacity of a born Italian singer. Well, she was Italian, on one side at least, and had inherited the tricks and a certain quality of voice, irresistibly catching. And she looked captivating as she sang, the small pointed face within its frame of reddish-brown hair, the strange eyes, the expressive red lips, alive with coquetry. The men, even the old politicians, listened and stared, quite fascinated. Some of the Leichardt's Town ladies, good, homely wives and mothers, who in their early married days of struggle had toiled and cooked and sewed, with no time to imagine an aspect of the eternal feminine of which they had never had any experience, were perhaps a little shocked, perhaps a little regretful. One or two others, younger, with budding aspirations, but provincial in their ideals, were filled with wonder and vague envy. A few of them had made the usual trip home, landing at Naples and journeying to London via Monte Carlo and Paris, and these felt they had missed something in that journey which Lady Bridget was now revealing to them. Joan Gildea, whose profession it was to realise vividly such modes of life as came within her purview, felt herself once more in the blue lands girdling the Sea of Story. It all came back upon her. Moonlight nights in Naples, on the Chiaia, looking down from her windows on sunny gardens on the Riviera and the strolling minstrels in front of the hotel. As for Colin McKeith, who had never been in the Blue Land and knew little even of the British Isles except for London, chiefly around St Paul's School, Hammersmith, and the Scotch manse where he had occasionally spent his holidays, even he was transported from the Government House drawing-room. Where? Not to the realm of visions such as he had seen in the smoke of his campfire. Oh no, he had never dreamed of this kind of enchantment. A fresh impulse seized the singer. She struck a few chords. A familiar lilt sounded. Her face and manner changed. She burst into the famous song of Carmen. She WAS Carmen. One could almost see the swaying form, the seductive flirt of fan. There could be no doubt that had the voice been more powerful, Lady Bridget might have done well on the operatic stage. Yet it had a timbre, a peculiar, devil-may-care passion which produced a very thrilling effect upon her audience. She got up when she had finished in a dead silence, and was halfway across the room before the applause burst out. There was a little rush of men towards her. "Beats Zilly de Lucerne and runs calve hard," said the Premier, who had made more than one trip to England and considered himself an authority on the matter. Bridget skimmed through the groups of admirers, stopping to murmur something to Lady Tallant, who had met her halfway, then stopped with hands before her like a meek schoolgirl in front of Mrs Gildea and Colin McKeith. He almost the only man who had made no movement towards her. Bridget sank into her former seat. "The last time I sang that was at a factory girls' entertainment at Poplar," she said. "You should have seen them, Joan. They stood up and tried to sing in chorus, and some of them came onto the platform and danced. Mr McKeith, you look at me as if I had been doing something desperately improper. Don't you like the music of Carmen?" Colin was staring at her dazedly. "It seemed to me a kind of witchcraft," he said. "I should think you might go on the stage and make a fortune, like Melba." She laughed. "Why, my voice is a very poor thing, and besides, I could never depend upon it." "Everything just how you feel at the time, eh?" he said. "You wouldn't care what you did if you had a mind to do it?" "No," she answered. "I shouldn't care in the least what I did if I had a mind to do it." There was the faintest mimicry of his half Scotch, half Australian accent in her voice, a little husky, with now and then unsuspected modulations. She looked at him, and the gleam in her eyes and her strange smile made him stare at her in a sort of fascination. Joan knew those tricks of hers, and knew that they boded mischief. She got up at the moment, saying that people were going and that she must bid Lady Tallant good night. Then the Premier's wife came up shyly. She wanted to thank Lady Bridget for her singing. It had been as good as the opera. They sometimes had good opera companies in Leichardt's Town, etc., etc. Lady Bridget made the prettiest curtsy, which bewildered the Premier's wife, and gave her food for speculation as to the manners and customs of the British aristocracy. She had always understood you only curtsied to royalty, but she took it as a great compliment, and never said anything but kind words about Bridget ever after. Colin McKeith escorted Mrs Gildea to her cab, and as they waited in the vestibule, obtained from her a few more particulars of Lady Bridget O'Hara's parentage and conditions, but he said not a word implying that he had discovered her identity with the author of the typed letter. "I'll come along tomorrow morning if I can manage it, and tell you about Alexandra City and the gas bore," he said carelessly as she shut the fly door. Joan wondered whether he had caught Lady Biddy's parting words in the drawing room. "If Rosamond doesn't insist on my doing some stuffy exploration with her, I'll bring my sketches some time in the morning, Joan, and you can see whether any of them would do for the great god Gibbs." End of Book 1, Chapter 10. Book 1, from the point of view of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 11 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land, by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. "And what are you going to do, Biddy? How long are you going to stay with the Tallants?" "Until Rosamond gets tired of me, or I feel no further need of the moral support of the British throne," answered Lady Bridget lightly. "I'm not sure whether I shall be able to stand Luke's jingo attitude in regard to Labour and the indigenous population. All the colonial problems in capitals, observe. He does take his position so strenuously. It's no good my reminding him that even the Queen is obliged to respect a constitutional government." Bridget took a cigarette from a gold case with her initials in tiny precious stones across it, and handed the case to Mrs Gildea, who shook her head. "Still too old-fashioned to smoke? I should have thought you'd have been driven to it here to keep the mosquitoes at a distance." "Do you like my case, Joan? Willoughby Maule gave it to me," she asked. "You didn't return it then?" "Why should I have hurt his feelings? We weren't engaged." A meditative pause, and then suddenly, "Evelyn Mary doesn't smoke. Nice girls don't." "Biddy, I shall be sorry for Evelyn Mary if the Maules are to live in London and you go back there again, which I suppose you will do." "You needn't suppose for certain that I shall go back." She savoured her cigarette slowly. "I can't go on with that old life, the sort of life one has to lead with Aunt Eliza and the Gavericks and their set. I can't go on pushing and striving and rushing here and there, in order to be seen at the right houses and join the hunt after fleeing eligibles." She gave a bitter little laugh, and then her tone changed to that ripple of frivolity in which nevertheless Mrs Gildea discerned the underbeat of tragedy. "Besides, even so, it's incongruous, impossible. I've come to the conclusion that the only things which make London, as I've known it, endurable, unlimited credit at a good dressmaker. Oh, and one of the beautiful new motor cars. You don't mind travelling from Dan to Beersheba if you can do it in 5 minutes. But when you've got to catch omnibuses or take the tube, dressed in garden party finery, well, it's all too disproportionate and tiresome." Mrs Gildea laughed. "You must remember that I am out of all your fine social business, except when I go as a reporter or look on from the upper boxes." "It's abominable, it's stifling," exclaimed Lady Biddy. "It kills all the best part of one. You know I've tried time after time to strike out on my own individual self, but I've always been brought back again by my hopeless, hopeless lack of practical knowledge of how to earn a livelihood. The one gift I'd inherited wasn't good enough to be of any use. If my mother had only left me the whole of her voice, I'd have been an opera singer, but I don't think I could have stood the drudgery, and I should have hated the publicity of it all. Joan, how did you ever manage to make yourself independent?" "By drudging," said Mrs Gildea dryly. "Besides, I was born differently, and I was brought up with practical people." "Mr McKeith, for instance. He told me about his having been what he called a cattle new chum on your father's station." "He wasn't exactly a new chum. His father had owned a sheep station up in the unsettled districts. There was a tragedy. The place was sold up when Colin was a boy. He wanted to learn how we did things further south. And besides, he was left without a penny. That's how he came to be with us." "Oh! Anyway, he's practical, but it isn't that side of him that appeals to me. He believes in missions, in a sort of way." Mrs Gildea laughed uneasily. "So you have discovered the streak of idealism in Colin. But," she veered off hastily, "I didn't want to talk about Colin McKeith. What I want to hear is about your own state of mind." "My state of mind? That's chaotic. The fact is, I feel in a horrible sort of transition state. It's just as if one were trying to wind a skein backwards, taking up one end and finding a confusion of knots, then taking up another and after forcing a few of the knots, giving the thing up in despair. One knows the right end is there, but how to find it through all that hopeless woolly tangle?" "Still, you must have learned something about how to wind your skein while you've been working through your various enterprises," said Mrs Gildea. She took up one of Bridget's sketches which were on the table and looked at it thoughtfully. "This is quite charming, Biddy. If only it wasn't too fine for reproduction. The block would cost more than the thing is worth." Biddy made a moue. "Oh, I know. Like me, isn't it? Impracticable. But I could do you some illustrations. I drew Rosamond entertaining the ministerial circle last night and showed it to Vereker Wells while we were waiting for breakfast. He nearly died with laughing. I couldn't have dared to let Luke see it." "That I can believe, and I should be murdered by the Leichardt'stonians if I allowed it to be published. But if you'd come with me through the Blue Mountains and caricature yourself exploring the Jenolan Caves, like the Lady of Quality in the Dolomite country, I could do something with that." Mrs Gildea alluded to their first and only collaboration as author and artist. "Yes, I might. We'll think about it. And if I did, perhaps I could make money enough to keep me out here for a year or two travelling about." Joan Gildea looked up in a startled way from the drawing she had been studying, and asked with some eagerness, "Biddy, do you really mean that you are thinking of stopping out here for a year or two?" "I do. I want to shake myself free from the old clogs. I want to be honest with myself and with the people who are honest with themselves. I've always envied you, Joan. Your life is real at least. You can put your finger on vital pulse beats. I should like to do as you are doing, study and learn from a country that has no traditions, but is making itself. I want to breathe nature unadulterated. If I could only reach the reality of her. Joan, I have the feeling that if one could go right up to the bush, far away from the Government House atmosphere and Luke Tallant's red tapeism and the stupid imitation of our English social shams, well, I think one might touch a more vital set of heartbeats than the heartbeats of civilization." "You are off civilization, Biddy?" "Yes, I am. I've had a horrible time. I was quite reckless and spent far too much on clothes and things. But that's not what matters. It's the effect on one's inner self that matters. And now I'm going through the pangs of revulsion, and just wondering where I can find anything that's true and satisfying. I believe it may be a kind of birth into a new life, coming out here, you know, and all the rest." She stopped. her long golden brown eyes fixed, sphinx-like, on Joan, who returned the gaze, but did not answer in words. Biddy went on. "Your work is practical, not idealistic. I believe the truth of it all is that the idealists haven't built up on a practical basis. There's too much pose. Joan, I do think it's only the pinch of starvation that knocks down the ridiculous pose of people." "True enough. Your cranks don't get much beyond pose. They think they do, but they don't." "Even the ones who believe in themselves, and who are in their way truly sincere. Joan, do you know, there were moments at the meetings I went to of those people, Christian Scientists and my spiritual socialists, and all those philo factory girls and tramps, and philo beasts and philo blacks and the rest of it, moments when a ghastly wonder would come over me whether, if we were all stranded on a desert island with a shortage of food and water, it wouldn't be a case of fighting for bare existence and of nature red of tooth and claw." "True for you, Lady Bridget. I like the way that's put," broke in a voice from the other side of the veranda railing. Lady Bridget started and looked round, a sudden flush rushing upon the ivory paleness of her face. If she had not had her back turned to the garden, if she had not left the gate open behind her, and if the wind in the bamboos had not then made a noisy rustling, she would have seen the visitor or heard his steps on the gravel path, or if she had not been so absorbed in her subject and her cigarette, she might have noticed that Mrs Gildea had looked up quickly a minute before and given a mute signal to the intruder not to interrupt the conversation untowardly. End of Book 1, Chapter 11. Book 1, from the point of view of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 12 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land, by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. Lady Bridget recovered herself as Colin McKeith mounted the steps and made the two ladies a rather self-conscious salute. "I suppose you know that's a quotation," she said. "Weren't you a bit out?" he answered, and repeated the phrase. "Excuse my correcting you." Bridget shrugged. "Thank you, but I always thought men of action weren't great readers. How did you do your reading?" "Some day, if you care to hear, I'll tell you." She looked at him interestedly. "Yes, I should care to hear." "Not now," put in Mrs Gildea. "You've come this morning to tell us about the gas bore at Alexandra City, and as it's got to go into my next letter, I shall take some notes. Do look for a comfortable chair, Colin, and you may smoke if you want to." "This is good enough," and he settled himself after his own fashion at Lady Bridget's feet with his back against the veranda post and his long legs sprawling over the steps. Lady Bridget leaned out of the depths of her deep canvas chair and offered him her cigarette case. He eyed it in amused criticism, the dull gold of the case and the initials in diamonds, sapphires and rubies set diagonally across it. "Your writing?" Again, the faint pink rose in her paleness. "No, it's the writing of the person who gave it to me." "Was it a man?" he asked bluntly. Bridget looked at him with slight haughtiness. "Really, Mr McKeith, I think you are inquisitive." "Yes, I am, and I've bush manners, not up to your form. Please excuse my impertinence." "I don't mind bush manners. They're rather refreshing sometimes. But," again extending and then half withdrawing her offering hand, "you despise my cigarettes?" He made an eager movement. "No, I shouldn't. Choose me one, won't you? 2, if I may have one to keep." "Why to keep?" She selected 2 of the dainty gold-tipped cigarettes, and he received them, almost as if they had been sacred symbols. One he placed carefully, notwithstanding her laughing protest, in a letter case which he carried in an inner pocket. She tilted her face forward for him to light the other cigarette at hers, and he did so, always with that suggestion of reverence which sat so oddly upon him. Mrs Gildea, watching the pair, was immensely struck by it. He smoked in silence for a few moments, his eyes still apparently fascinated by the glittering initials on the case which now Bridget attached to her chatelaine chain. She threw away the end of her cigarette. "Well, so you've become the Governor's unconstitutional adviser," she said. "Joan, do you know that Luke Tallant kept Mr McKeith talking and smoking in the loggia just below my bedroom for hours last night after everyone had gone? I know, because I couldn't get to sleep." McKeith had all compunction. "I'm downright sorry for that, Lady Bridget. I'd have gone away if I'd only guessed your room was up above." "Oh, it didn't matter. I'd lots to think about. My own shortcomings and Luke's responsibilities." "He takes them hard," hazarded McKeith. "I hope you gave him good advice," put in Mrs Gildea. McKeith's lips twisted into a humorous smile. "Well, I told Sir Luke that I didn't think he need bother himself just yet awhile over that northern tour of inspection he's talking about." "He wants to make a kind of royal progress, Joan, through the back blocks," said Lady Biddy. "It'll mean a bit of stiff riding," said McKeith, "but I've offered to show him round the Upper Leura anyway, and to find him a quiet hack." "Rosamond flatly declines the royal progress," said Bridget. "I'm coming instead of her." "Can you ride?" he asked. "Can I ride? Can any O'Hara ride? You needn't find me a quiet hack." "All right," said McKeith, "but I wouldn't make sure of that by putting you on a buck jumper. It's a bargain then, Lady Bridget." "A bargain? What?" "You promise to pay me a visit when the Governor makes his trip north, when he carries out his notion of establishing military patrols and a Maxim gun or two to put down trades unionism and native outrages in the back blocks." Lady Bridget looked at him thoughtfully. He had pulled out his tobacco pouch and was filling a well-worn pipe. "You won't mind my pipe, will you, as you're a smoker yourself? Mrs Gildea likes it best, and so do I." Lady Bridget sniffed his raw tobacco and made a tiny moue. "Well, if you prefer that, no, of course I don't mind. I see," she went on, "that you favour the Maxim gun idea, Mr McKeith. I understand that you're one of the oppressors, and you and I wouldn't agree on that point." Mr McKeith returned her look, all the hardness in his face softening to an expression of almost tender indulgence. "We'd see about that. I might convert you, but in the back blocks." "Or I might convert you." He shook his head and then laughed in a shy boyish way. "There's no knowing what might happen, but in the back blocks." Lady Bridget leaned forward. "Tell me about them. Tell me about your life in the bush and what makes you hate the blacks." "What makes me hate the blacks?" he repeated slowly, and the soft look on his face changed now to one very dour and grim. "You do hate them, don't you, Mr McKeith? The Premier told me something about you last night which simply filled me with horror. If I believed it, or unless I knew that what you did had been in honourable warfare, I don't think I could bear to speak to you again. Now I'm going to ask you if it's true." "Is what true, Lady Bridget? I'll tell you the truth if you ask me for it about anything I've done. But, I warn you, ugly things happen in the back blocks." "The Premier said that you were the terror of the natives. He told me about a gun you have with a great many notches on the barrel of it, and he said that each notch represented a blackfellow that you had killed." "I never killed a blackfellow except in fair fight, or under lawful provocation. Many a time one of them has sneaked a spear at me from behind a gum tree, and I'd have been done for if I hadn't been keeping a sharp lookout." "But you were taking their land," Lady Bridget exclaimed impetuously. "You had come, an invader, into their territory. What right had you to do that? You were the aggressor, and you can't judge them by the moral laws of civilised humanity. They fought in the only way they understood." "Lady Bridget, there are moral laws which all humanity, civilised or savage, understands. I'm not saying that no white man in the bush has ever violated these laws. I'm not saying that the blacks hadn't something on their side. I'm only saying that in my experience, it was the black man and not the white man who was the aggressor, and when you ask me what made me hate the blacks, well, it isn't a pretty story. But if you like, I'll tell it to you sometime." "Tell me now," she exclaimed. "Oh, Joan, won't your notes keep?" Mrs Gildea had got up, a sheaf of pencils and a reporter's notebook in her hand. "Yes, for a few minutes. But I've just remembered something I've got to refer to in one of Mr Gibbs' letters. Don't mind me, I'll be back presently." McKeith seemed to take no heed of her departure. His eyes were fixed on Lady Bridget. There was in them a light of inward excitement. "Please go on," she said. "I want so much to hear." He thought for a few moments, shook the ashes from his pipe, and then plunged into his story. "I've got to go back to when I was quite a youngster, taken from school. I went to St Paul's in the Hammersmith Road, just before I was 17. You see, before that my father had scraped together his little bit of money and we'd been living in West Kensington, waiting while he made out what we were all going to do. He wasn't any great shakes, my father, in the way of birth and fortune. I dare say you guessed that, Lady Bridget." She tossed her head back impatiently. "Oh, what does that matter? Go on, please." "He'd been a farmer, Glasgow way." McKeith still pronounced it Glasgow. "And my mother was a minister's daughter, as good a woman and as true a lady as ever breathed. But that's neither here nor there in what turned out a bad business. Well, we all emigrated out here, and, after a while, my old dad bought a station on the Lower Leura. Taken in he was, of course, over the deal, not realising that it was unsettled country in those days. So the whole family of us started up from the coast to it. He drove my mother and my 2 sisters, just grown up, and a woman servant, Marty, in a double buggy, and Jerry the bullock driver and me in the dray with him, and taught me to drive bullocks. There were stock boys, 2 of them riding alongside. It took us 3½ weeks to reach the station, averaging about 30 miles a day and camping out each night. I'd like you to camp out in the bush sometime, Lady Bridget, right away from everything. It'd be an experience that'd live with you all your life. My word, it's like nothing else, lying straight under the Southern Cross and watching its pointers, and one by one the stars coming up above the gum trees, and the queer wild smell of the gums, and the loneliness of it all. Not a sound until the birds begin at dawn, but the hop-hop of the wallabies, and the funny noises of opossums, and the crying of the curlews and native dogs, dingoes we call 'em. Well there, I won't bother you with all that. Though truly I tell you it's the nearest touch with the infinite I've ever known. Lord, I remember the first night I camped right in the bush, me rolled in my blanket on one side of the fire, and Leura Jim the black boy on the other. And the wonder of it all coming over me as I laid broad awake thinking of the contrast between London and its teeming millions, and the awful solitude of the bush. I wonder if your blood would have run cold as mine did when the grass rustled under stealthy footsteps, and me thinking it was the blacks sneaking us, and the relief of hearing 3 dismal howls and knowing it was dingoes and not blacks. "I'd have loved it," murmured Bridget tensely. "Go on, please." "Well, I've got to come to the tragedy. It began this way through an act of kindness on our journey up. We were going through the bunya bunya country not far from our station, when out of the bush there came a black gin with 2 half-caste girls. She ran up and stopped the buggy and implored my mother's protection for her girls, because the blacks wanted to kill and eat them." "Oh! Oh!" Biddy made a shuddering exclamation. "Didn't I say the blacks hadn't everything on their side? I ought to explain, though, that in our district were large forests of a kind of pine. There's one in this garden," and he pointed to a pyramidal fir tree with spreading branches of small pointed leaves spiked at the ends, and with a cone of nuts about the size of a big man's head hanging from one of the branches. "That's the bunya bunya, and the nuts are splendid roasted in the ashes, if ever that one gets properly ripe. It has to be yellow, you know. I'll ask Joan Gildea to let me roast it for you. Only it wouldn't be the same thing at all as when it's done in a fire of gum logs, the nuts covered with red ashes and then peeled and washed down with quart pot tea." "Quart pot tea? What a lot you'll have to show me if I ever come to your station in the back blocks." "Different from your London life, eh? Your balls and dinners and big shows and coaching meets in Hyde Park, and all the rest of the flummery. Different too from your kid-glove fox hunts over grass fields and trimmed hedges and puddles of ditches. The sort of thing you've been accustomed to, Lady Bridget, when you've gone out from your castle for a sporting spree." "A sporting spree!" She laughed with a child's merriment, and he joined in the laugh. "It's clear to me, Mr McKeith, that you've never hunted in Ireland. And how did you know, by the way, that I lived in a castle?" "I was led to believe that a good many of your kind owned historic castles which your forefathers had won and defended with the sword," he answered, a little embarrassed. "That's true enough, but if you could see Castle Gaverick! My old aunt is always talking of restoring it, but she never will, and if my cousin Chris Gaverick ever does come into it, he'd rather spend his money in doing something else. But never mind that. I want to hear about the black gin and the half-caste girls, and if your mother saved them from the cannibals, and why the blacks wanted to eat their own kind. Dog doesn't eat dog, at least, so they tell one." "It's this way. Our blacks weren't regular cannibals, but in the bunya season they'd all collect in the scrubs and feed on the nuts and nothing else for months. Then after a bit they'd get meat hungry, and there not being many wild animals in Australia, and only a few cattle in those outlying districts, they'd satisfy their cravings by killing and eating some of themselves, lubras. Young girls, by preference, and naturally half-castes, as having no particular tribal status, for choice." "Half-castes?" she repeated, a little puzzled. "These ones had Chinky blood in them, daughters of a Chinaman fossicker. We're not partial to the Chinese in Australia. Only we don't eat them, we expel them. Method's just a bit dissimilar, but the principle the same, you see. Anyway, of course we took on the gin and her girls, and for about a year didn't have any particular trouble at the station with the blacks, though there was a shepherd speared in one of the out huts. That was his fault, however, poor devil, the old story, but it don't matter. The trouble came to a head with a black boy called Leura Jimmy that Jerry the bullock driver brought up with him and left at the station, where he went down to the township for store supplies. He took me with him. I told you I was learning bullock driving." McKeith paused and the dark look came upon his face. "And Leura Jimmy?" put in Bridget. "Oh, he was a fine big fellow, plausible too, and could speak pidgin English. He was never weaned from his tribe, and he was a treacherous scoundrel at heart. As a precautionary measure my father forbade the blacks to come up to the head station, but Jimmy fell in love with the eldest of the half-caste girls. She encouraged him at first, then took up with one of the stock boys. It was the bunya season again, and the girls' old tribe under their king Mograbar, a devil incarnate in a brute. I sent him to hell afterwards with my own hand and never did a better deed." McKeith's brown fists clenched and the fury in his eyes blazed so that he himself looked almost devilish for a moment. His face remained very grim and dour as he proceeded. "Jimmy had got to know through the half-caste girl about our ways and doings, and he made a diabolical plot with King Mograbar to get the blacks into the house. Every living soul was murdered, surprised in their sleep. My father, my mother, my sisters. God, I can't speak of it." He got up abruptly, jerking his long legs, and went to the further end of the veranda, where he stood with set features and brows like a red bar, below which staring eyes were fixed vacantly upon the avenue of bunya trees in the long walk of the botanical gardens across the river. But they did not see those bunya trees. What they saw was a row of mutilated bodies lying stark along the veranda of that head station on the Leura. Bridget was leaning forward in her squatter's chair, her fingers grasping the arms of it, her face very white and her eyes staring too, as though they also beheld the scene of horror. Presently McKeith came back, pale too, but quite composed. "I beg your pardon," he said stiffly. "Perhaps I should not have told you." "It's horrible, but I'm glad to know. Thank you for telling me." He looked at her wistfully. There was silence for a moment or two. "And you, where were you?" she stammered. "Me? I was with the drays, you know. We got back about noon that day. If we'd been 12 hours sooner! Well, I suppose I should have been murdered with the rest. The blacks had gone off with their loot. We buried our dead. And then we ran up our best horses and never drew rein for 40 miles till we got to where a band of the native police were camped. And then we took what vengeance we could. It wasn't complete till a long time afterwards." He was standing behind Bridget's chair, his eyes still gazing beyond the river. He did not notice that she leaned back suddenly, and her hands fell nervelessly to her lap. He felt a touch on his arm. It was Mrs Gildea, who had come out to the veranda again. "Colin," she said, "I want you to go and bring me my typewriter from the parlour, and then you've got to dictate copy about the Alexandra gas bore. Please go at once." He obeyed. Mrs Gildea bent over Lady Bridget. "Biddy, you're not faint, are you?" Lady Bridget roused herself and looked up at her friend rather wildly. "No. What do you take me for? I said I wanted real things, Joan, and I've got them." She laughed a little hysterically. "All right, but we shall give you a taste of real Australia that isn't quite so gruesome. But some of the tragedy belongs to the pioneer days. I could tell you things myself that my father has told me, but I won't. Mind, Colin McKeith is no more of a hero than a dozen bush boys I knew when I first knew him. Yes, put it there, Colin, please. And now, if Biddy doesn't mind, we'll proceed to business, which is my imperialist letter. I suppose you haven't brought back any snapshots of Alexandra City and your wonderful gas bore that Mr Gibbs could get worked up for his paper." End of Book 1, Chapter 12. Book 1, from the point of view of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 13 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. That was not the only time Lady Bridget and McKeith met on Mrs Gildea's veranda. In fact, Biddy, reminiscent of wild sea excursions along the shore by Castle Gaverick, developed a passion for what she called team boating on the Leichhardt River. She found a suitable skiff in the boathouse, the Government House grounds sloped to the water's edge, and would row herself up and down the river reaches. It was easy to round the point, skirt the botanical gardens, and crossing above the ferry, land below Mrs Gildea's cottage, then climb up the bank and enter by a lower gate to the garden. Thus she would often turn up unexpectedly of mornings for a chat with her friend in the veranda study. At this time, Colin McKeith contracted a similar habit. He showed a still greater interest in Mrs Gildea's journalistic work, and professed a strong desire to enlighten British statesmen, through the medium of Mr Gibbs's admirable paper, on certain imperial questions affecting Australia: the danger of a Japanese invasion in the northern waters, the establishment of a naval base by Germany in New Guinea, the yellow labour problem, and so forth. He would intersperse his political dissertation with racy bits of description of life in the bush, and would give the points of view of pearl fishers, miners, loafers, officials in out-of-the-way townships, labour reformers, sheep and cattle owners, all of which vastly amused Lady Bridget, and was valuable copy, typed unscrupulously by Mrs Gildea. In fact, she owed to it much of the success which later attended her journalistic venture. Mrs Gildea thought at first that the copy would be more easily obtainable in the intervals before and after Lady Bridget's arrival, or on the days when she failed to come. But finding that Colin was distinctly at his best as a narrator, with Biddy for an audience, she artfully arranged to take her notes under those conditions. This lasted 2 or 3 weeks, during which period Sir Luke and Lady Tallant conscientiously improved their acquaintance with the new sphere of their labours. They visited hospitals, inspected public buildings, inaugurated social schemes, and, to the strains of God Save the Queen, performed many other insignificant public functions, from which, as often as not, their guest Lady Bridget basely cried off. On one such occasion, Joan, arrayed in her best, had patriotically gone forth on a steaming March day to support their Excellencies, fondly expecting that, as arranged, Lady Bridget and Colin would meet her. But Lady Tallant, looking distinctly cross, accompanied the Governor alone. Bridget, it appeared, had come down, just as the carriage drove up, in her morning frock and garden hat, saying that she had a bad headache and meant to spend the afternoon in a hammock by the river bank. As for Colin, there was no sign of him. But when Mrs Gildea got home, very tired and hot, she was made extremely angry by hearing the voices of Lady Bridget and McKeith in the veranda where they were drinking tea and, it seemed, holding a confidential conversation. Mrs Gildea's gorge rose higher. She had to stop a minute to try and recover her temper. Here was Biddy disburdening herself to Colin of her family troubles and shortcomings, showing herself and them in the worst light, singing small to a man with whom it was highly desirable she should maintain her dignity. Instead of that, she was deliberately pulling down the barrier of rank and social position which should exist between Lady Bridget O'Hara and the factor's son, the outback squatter, Colin McKeith. Biddy was saying, "Oh, but you're as bad as that sort of person who can't be made to realise that the oldest peerage in Ireland counts for nothing in comparison with an oil king's millions and being able to entertain the right set. And besides, really, Mr McKeith, there's no difference at all between us. You talk such a lot about your grandfather having been a Scotch peasant. Why, my mother's father was an Italian beggar. Oh, haven't you seen them with their crutches and things on the steps of the churches? And my mother sang in the streets of Naples until a kind musician heard her and had her trained to be an opera singer." "Your mother?" "My mother! That's where my Carmen comes from, only that my voice, I'm told, isn't to be compared with what hers was. But that's not the worst about my mother. Not that I blame her. I think that a woman has a perfect right to leave her husband if she has ceased to care for him, and that it's far more moral to live with a man you love and can't marry than with a husband you hate." Mrs Gildea cut short Lady Bridget's exposition of her views on morality before McKeith had time to answer. Her voice was sharp as she went up the steps and arraigned the pair. "Really, Biddy, I do call this too bad of you. May I ask how you and Mr McKeith come to be drinking tea together in my veranda?" "Sure, and it's by accident entoirely," answered Biddy, with a whimsical look and the touch of the brogue she sometimes put on when a situation became embarrassing. "A prearranged accident!" "No, it wasn't, Joan. As a matter of fact, we were the last persons either of us expected to meet." "Honour bright," put in McKeith. "I'd forgotten all about the Pineapple Products Exhibition, and I just dropped in at Government House to pay my respects after a pleasant dinner 2 nights ago. What you'd call a visit of digestion." "And since when, Colin, have you become an observer of social obligations?" jeered Mrs Gildea. He grinned. "Ah, you have me there. Anyway, I asked for Lady Bridget and found her down by the boat shed." "And we thought it would be cooler on the water, so he rowed me round the point. It was the most natural thing in the world that we should discover we were thirsty, and that we should come up to the garden and ask your old woman to give us some tea. Don't be a cat, Joan. You never used to be so grudging of your hospitality." Mrs Gildea quickly recovered her usual genial demeanour. She poured herself out a cup of tea and remarked that it was refreshing after the pineapple syrups and other concoctions she had, as in duty bound, sampled at the show. Lady Bridget rattled along with questions about the function and the behaviour of the Government House party. Had Sir Luke been too overpoweringly pompous? Was Lady Tallant really cross? And had Vereker Wells made any more blunders? And so forth. But she did not enlighten Mrs Gildea much about her doings with Colin McKeith, and presently said she must go and make her peace with Rosamond. McKeith accompanied her, naturally, since he had to row her back to the Government House landing. There was something in the manner of the pair that Mrs Gildea could not understand. Of course, Colin was in love, that she knew already. But was Biddy merely playing with the big primitive-souled bushman, or was it possible that she too could be in love? End of Book 1, Chapter 13. Book 1, From the Point of View of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 14 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land by Rosa Praed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. The next time Biddy came, Joan tackled matters boldly. "Biddy, I've had my marching orders. Mr Gibb finds Leichardt's Land a bit stale. I take a train to Sydney next week and tour the Riverina, the Blue Mountains and the country along the railway to Melbourne. Are you coming with me?" Bridget gave a deprecatory laugh. "I don't know. What would Rosamond say?" "She'd recognise the necessities of the situation. Besides, you could come back again." "I haven't been here a month, and I don't find Leichardt's Land stale. On the contrary, I find it extremely stimulating. No, I think the Riverina and the Blue Mountains will keep as far as I'm concerned." "But I won't keep. Mr Gibb and the drawings for the Imperialist won't keep. The question is whether you want to make some money or not." "It's the one thing I've wanted to do all my life, and have never yet succeeded in doing except when we collaborated in The Lady of Quality." "Here's your chance for a continuation series, The Lady of Quality in the Bush. How does that sound?" "Rather clumsy and long, don't you think? Lady Bridget in the Bush would be more alliterative and catching. Only I should be giving myself away." "I think you're doing that already," said Mrs Gildea. "How do you mean, Joan? I don't see it." "Yes, you do. Look here, Biddy, Colin McKeith isn't Mr Willoughby Maule." "He's 100 times better man, Joan." "That you needn't tell me, and I'm glad you recognise the fact, but from the point of view of the Lady of Quality, would he be a better husband?" "You forget, my dear, that I'm not the genuine article. I'm nothing but a pinchbeck imitation of the real Lady of Quality. If his grandfather was a peasant, remember that my maternal grandparents were peasants too. I told him so yesterday." "Has it come to that? You go fast, Biddy, but I warn you, Colin McKeith isn't the man to be trifled with. He knows his own mind. The question is whether you know yours." Biddy nodded her head like a Chinese mandarin. 2 months ago you were wildly in love, or at least, from your letters one might have judged so, with another man," said Mrs Gildea. No, don't call that love." "Call it a violent attraction then. I suspect the man could have made you marry him if he had chosen. So far as I can understand, you quarrelled because neither of you would face matrimony on what you considered an inadequate income." "Middle class respectability, living in Pimlico or further Kensington," scoffed Biddy. "Ordering sprats and plaice for dinner and pretending they're soles in whitebait. Perambulators stubbing up the hall. Paying your own books and having your gown made at home. No thank you. Possum skins and a black scunyer. That's Australese for a wigwam, isn't it? Appeal to me infinitely more." Mrs Gildea threw up her hands. "Biddy, you haven't the faintest notion how dull and uncomfortable, how utterly unpoetic, how sordid the life of a struggling bushman can be." "No. You know, Joan, I think that it might be perfectly fascinating, if one really cared for the bushman." "Really cared? Have you ever really cared for any man? Could you ever really care?" "That's what I've been asking myself. It would have to be someone quite different from all the other men I've liked, something altogether above the ordinary man, to make me really care." "You said that Mr Willoughby Maule was different from any man you'd ever met. Each man you've ever fancied yourself in love with has been different from all the rest." Lady Bridget laughed, rather uneasily. "How tiresomely exact you are, Joan. Of course they were different. Everybody is different from everybody else, and I attract marked types. Will was more marked and more attractive, as well as attracted, that's all." "His attraction doesn't seem to have been as strong as self-interest, anyway," said Joan, with deliberate terseness. The girl's small, pale face flushed to deep crimson for a moment. "Joan, you are cruel. You know that was the sting, and it wouldn't have stung so if I hadn't cared. Sometimes I feel the maddest desire to hurt him, to pay him out. I never felt like that about any of the others, the ones I really did almost want to marry. And then at other times I'd give anything just to have him again as he used to be." "I'm certain you weren't really in love with him," exclaimed Mrs Gildea. Bridget seemed to be considering. "Wasn't I? I'm not so sure of that. No," she went on impetuously, "I was not really in love with him. He had a magnetic influence over me, as I told you. Perhaps I might get a little under it again if he were to appear suddenly without his wife. It turns me sick to think of a married man having a magnetic influence over me, even if there was no wife, now. So when you've idealised a person and can't idealise him any more, c'est fini. There's nothing but a ghost to come and make you uncomfortable sometimes, and that can't last. Besides, I've been breathing the strong clear air of your gum trees lately. It's a case of pull devil, pull bushman. Do you see?" "I see, my dear, that you're idealising Colin McKeith, and let me tell you that a bushman is very far removed from the superman. Oh, Colin is a fine enough specimen of a pioneer in a rough country, but his rough life, his bush surroundings and all the rest, why, he'd jar upon you in 100 ways if you were alone with him in them. Then, he's not of your order, though I hate the phrase and I hate the kind of man. All the same, Biddy, you may pretend to despise the men of your own class, but I fancy that, after a spell of roughing it with Colin on the Upper Leura, you'd hanker after something in them that Colin hasn't and never will have. And then," Joan's swift imagination carried her on with a rush, "you don't know in the least the type of man he is. You'd have to give in to him. He'd never give in to you. He's domineering, jealous, vindictive and reserved. Before a month was out you'd quarrel, and there would be no chance of your ever making it up again." "I must say, Joan, that for a friend of his you're not an enthusiastic advocate." "It's because I'm so fond of Colin that I hate the thought of you making him miserable. Anyway, however, you're bound to do that." "I don't see why." "If you flirt with him and then drop him, he'll suffer, though he'll be too proud to show it. And as for the alternative, it's out of the question. You must see that it would be sheer folly." "I've committed a great many follies," said Bridget wistfully. "But so far none that are quite irrevocable." "Well, he hasn't asked me yet to commit this one." "You're leading him on to it. Biddy, it is abominable of you to encourage him as you do, coming here with him that day, and you let him take you riding." "Yes, he knows now that I can ride." "And he's at Government House nearly every day. I can't think what Lady Tallant is about to ask him so often to dinner." "She likes him because he takes Luke off her hands. You know we've nicknamed him the Unconstitutional Adviser." "That's rubbish. You sing to him." "What harm is there in my singing to Colin McKeith?" "As if you didn't know well enough that you're perfectly irresistible when you look at a man while you're singing those Neapolitan things. Biddy, it won't do. Give it up." "I can't do that, Joan." She spoke with a strange earnestness. "Don't you see that it's giving me a chance?" "Of forgetting Mr Willoughby Maule?" "Yes, but it's more than that." "More than that? Do you mean can you mean that you could love Colin McKeith for himself?" "Love is a big word, Joan. I've never said to any man, 'I love you.'" She spoke the words now as if she were uttering a sacred formula. Her voice reminded Mrs Gildea of something, the same note in the voice of Colin McKeith when he, too, had spoken of love. Yet what she had said was true. Bridget had talked often enough of falling in love. which she had always been at pains to define as a mere transitory condition, not by any means the real thing, and she had freely confessed to violent attractions and even adorations, but as she had sometimes solemnly stated, she had never loved. "I can't explain," she went on. "I know you think me a heartless emotional flirt. Yes, I am, I admit it. But there's a locked door in the inner chamber, a shrine that no one has desecrated. The goddess is in there, waiting to reveal herself." "And so, all the rest have been experiments?" "No, the quest of the ideal through the forest of illusion. I've often thought, Joan, there was a lot in the motive of that novel of Thomas Hardy's, The Well-Beloved. But I seem to be mixing up my metaphors, and it's time I went back to Government House." She got up and began putting on her gloves. Mrs Gildea laughed hysterically. Somehow she could not imagine Colin McKeith producing the golden key and masterfully taking possession of Lady Bridget's locked shrine. She could only think of him as tricked, deceived and suffering hideously at the end. She stammered out her fear, beseeching Biddy to be merciful, but Biddy's mood had changed, and she only smiled her sphinx smile. "I think he's quite able to look after himself," she said, "and if he isn't, sure, he must take the consequences." End of Book 1, Chapter 14. Book 1, from the point of view of Mrs Gildea. Chapter 15 of Lady Bridget in the Never Never Land. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. Mrs Gildea could get nothing more out of Lady Bridget. She attacked McKeith in a more tentative manner, but Colin was doggedly reticent. He was taking the thing hardly. His way of facing a serious situation was by setting his teeth and saying nothing. After these unsuccessful attempts, Joan made opportunity, before leaving, for a private word on the subject with Lady Tallant. But Rosamond Tallant treated the matter, at first, very lightly. "Dear Mrs Gildea, you needn't worry, it's only Biddy's way. She must have some excitement to keep her going. If it isn't one thing, it's another. In London I tried to interest her in society or politics and the opera, and now Luke is trying to interest her in colonial questions, but she always drifts back to men. She can't help it. And the funny thing is, I don't believe that in her heart she is capable of a serious attachment." "I'm not so sure of that," answered Mrs Gildea. "If so, she has plenty of opportunities of proving it. But I wasn't ever afraid, even of Willoughby Maule. I was certain that would fizzle out before real harm could come of it. And mercifully it did. He's married a woman with $250,000 and the right to dispose of it absolutely as she pleases. I heard that she signed a will on her wedding day, leaving it all to him in the event of her death. Too great a temptation, wasn't it? Though I do think, if Biddy had chosen, she might have kept him in spite of Miss Bagalay and her money. As it is, Colin McKeith, or else the novelty of it all out here, has driven him out of her head. I felt sure of that when I asked her to come. You needn't worry about her." "It's not so much about Biddy that I'm worrying as about my old friend Colin McKeith," said Mrs Gildea. "It isn't fair that he should be made a victim." "Oh well, it isn't altogether Biddy's fault that she attracts all types of men." And then Lady Tallant made exactly the same remark as Lady Bridget. "I think Mr McKeith is quite able to look after himself. I don't pity him in the least. Didn't somebody say of Lady something or other that to love her was a liberal education?" "Steele said it of Lady Elizabeth Hastings." "I call it a liberal education for Colin McKeith to love Lady Bridget O'Hara," laughed Lady Tallant. Mrs Gildea changed her tactics and voiced her other fear, a more insistent fear. "Has it ever occurred to you that Lady Bridget O'Hara might fall in love with Colin McKeith?" "Why, my dear, she's wildly in love with him already," rejoined Lady Tallant, to Joan Gildea's surprise. "You've seen it?" "I'm not blind, and I know Biddy. But I've seen that she's taking this affair differently from the others, and that's what makes me think it has gone deeper. A very good thing for Biddy." "You can't mean that it would be a good thing for Biddy to marry Colin McKeith?" Lady Tallant's social manner was rather full of affectations. Underneath it, however, lay common sense and sympathy. She became suddenly simple and direct. "Well now, Mrs Gildea, let us look at the matter without prejudice. You are fond of Biddy and so am I. But we know her drawbacks. Naturally it wouldn't be a good thing under ordinary conditions. But is she likely to do much better?" "She has had plenty of chances." "And thrown them all away. and though she looks so young, she is close on 30. Of course with her looks and her fascination she ought to have married well. I'm sure her friends have tried hard enough for her, but what can you do with a girl who throws herself at the heads of ineligibles, and when one trots out an unexceptionable parti and does one's best to bring them together, goes off at a tangent and lets the whole thing drop through? You know how it was with " Lady Tallant enumerated names. Mrs Gildea acquiesced mournfully. Lady Tallant continued. The truth is, Biddy has tired out the patience of her relatives and friends. Molly and Chris Gaverick got the hump over Willoughby Maule, who would have done well enough if he had only had more money. Old Eliza, so Lady Tallant irreverently styled the Dowager Countess of Gaverick, told me herself that she was going to wash her hands of Biddy. I shouldn't wonder if she didn't leave her a penny. And, after all, it was her own fortune, and she has a horde of needy relatives. She will consider that she has done her duty to the Gavericks if she lets Chris have the castle. When all's said and done, I don't see that it would be such a bad thing for Biddy to marry a rich Australian squatter. Colin McKeith is not rich. Oh, he will be. Sir Luke has been hearing all about him. He's not her equal. His father was just a land bailiff, and his grandfather a crofter. Oh, what does that matter? In these days, any of us would marry the roughest of rough diamonds, provided he was decently well off. Biddy has always been mad after adventure and an open-air life. She's an original, and everything would be in keeping. Lady Tallant went on briskly. She would enjoy living among the blacks, provided they did not murder her, and I suppose one could trust Mr McKeith for that. Oh, there's no danger from the blacks now, put in Mrs Gildea. And then she needn't be buried forever in the bush. Luke tells me that Colin McKeith is certain to come to the fore in politics. I daresay he will be Premier of Leichardt's Land before long. Biddy would like bossing the show and airing her philanthropic crazes. Mrs Gildea shook her head doubtfully. Colin wouldn't agree with them. Besides, she would be expatriated. Oh no, the big men over here are always taking trips to England, being feted and made much of in Downing Street, imperialist policy and that sort of thing. I can see Biddy at it. Mrs Gildea was silent. She scarcely knew Lady Tallant in this downright mood. There's no use blinking matters, said that lady. At home, Biddy has been a failure. That was why I persuaded her to come out with us. I knew she wanted a fresh start badly. It was quite true. Mrs Gildea remembered Bridget's confidences to herself. She could not help feeling that Lady Tallant was right in the main, and put forward no more objections. But she explained her own plans and the necessity for her immediate departure from Leichardt's Land, how she had hoped too to take Biddy with her and interest her once more in literary and artistic work. Biddy won't go, she told me so, and I don't mean to let her, said Lady Tallant decidedly. We're short-handed till the new private secretary gets here, and she helps me with my notes and things generally. And if it wasn't for Biddy's singing, our dinners would be too deadly dull for words. Joan gave up in despair. She suspected that Lady Tallant's affectionate candour was not unadulterated with selfishness. Finally, Rosamond promised that she would interest and amuse Lady Bridget to such an extent as would deter her from rash love-making for want of counter-excitement. Then, Joan reflected, Colin was preeminently a prudent businessman, and as he had told her some time before, would have to go back to the Upper Leura before the strenuous work of the session came on. This was always supposing that the present ministry kept in, without going to the country upon certain labour measures unacceptable to the large landowners, in which case it was just possible McKeith might be thrown out of his seat. Events lay in the lap of the gods. Mrs Gildea wound up matters at the cottage and took train south, where she was soon wholly occupied in describing the wonder of the Jenolan Caves and the wild gorges and primeval gum forests in the Blue Mountains. She was really too busy in the interests of the imperialists to worry over her friend's love affairs. In fact, she gleaned most of her information as to the Leichardt's Town Government House party from the newspapers she happened upon at bush hotels. For Lady Bridget was evidently in a reactionary mood as regards letter writing, and Colin McKeith never put pen to paper if he could avoid doing so, except on business. It was at Mossvale that she read a florid paragraph in the ladies' page of a Sydney journal, telling of the engagement of that intrepid pioneer and future empire builder, Mr Colin McKeith, to the Lady Bridget O'Hara, niece of the late and cousin of the present Earl of Gaverick. Next post brought her 3 brief and characteristic letters. She opened Lady Tallant's first. Government House, Leichardt's Town. Dear Mrs Gildea, I do hope this may catch you before the newspapers, which I find announced the engagement rather prematurely last week. I am still of opinion that Biddy might do much worse than marry Colin McKeith though, entre nous, the settlements, or rather want of them, for Mr McKeith tells us that he needs all his capital for making wells and buying cattle, and he won't injure his prospects and Biddy's by tying it up, does not at all please Sir Luke, who, before he would countenance the marriage, insisted upon a cablegram being sent to the Dowager Lady Gaverick. Her answer, "Not my business, must do as she pleases," only confirms what I said to you, and I am afraid Biddy's chances are worth nothing in that quarter. The wedding is to be early in May, from Government House, of course, and I need scarcely say how much we all hope you will come back for it. Always sincerely, Rosamond Tallant. P.S. No doubt Biddy is giving you full details. But Biddy did not indulge either in details or rhapsodies. She began. They say hanging and wiving go by destiny, and clearly my destiny is to become the wife of Colin McKeith. I've always felt that the only thing which could reconcile me to marriage would be marrying a man, and at last I've found one. I want to tell you, Joan, that we've made an agreement to ask each other no questions about respective pasts. The blackfellows he has slain, the one jarring note between us, are never to be resuscitated. The men whose hearts I have broken, and vice versa, are dead and buried on the other side of the equator, under a monument of inviolable silence. Such are the terms of the marriage contract, and you in especial must respect them. I need say no more, except this: have no fears for the happiness of your Biddy. From Colin in telegraphic conciseness. Tremendously happy. She's absolutely my ideal, in everything but size. All very satisfactory and conclusive, but Mrs Gildea could not escape from a vague misgiving. She was not afraid of the ghost of Mr Willoughby Maule. Indeed, she argued favourably from the baldness of Bridget's letter in comparison with the reams of sentiment she had written upon the previous occasion. Nor did she feel uneasy on the score of any others of Lady Bridget's bygone passions. But had this complex, fastidious, physically refined creature the least comprehension of what life on the Upper might mean? And how about an ideal dethroned from her pedestal and plumped down amid the crude realities of the nethermost bush? Mrs Gildea did not get to the wedding. She was ordered to report on the mines of Western Australia, and was on the other side of the continent when the marriage took place. In fact, it seemed doubtful whether she would again meet Lady Bridget before her mission as special correspondent ended. But the McKeiths were to spend their honeymoon in travelling to his station on the Upper Leura, a distance of some hundreds of miles from the nearest port, and quite out of the imperialist programme. She read, however, circumstantial accounts of the wedding, and there were portraits of the pair, in which Colin looked grumpy and Lady Bridget whimsically amused. Snapshots too of the wedding cortege, in which Sir Luke Tallant, fathering the bride, appeared a pompous figure in full uniform, and Lady Tallant in splendid panoply, most stately and gracious. A long account followed of the bride's family connections, in which the biographer touched upon the accident of sex that had deprived her of the hereditary honours, the ancient descent of the Gavericks, with a picture of the old Irish castle where Lady Bridget had been brought up, and so forth, and so forth. Mrs Gildea sighed as she read and pictured in her imagination the wild wastes of the Never Never Land and the Rough Head station which was to be Lady Bridget's home. End of Book 1, Chapter 15.